Villages remain dark except for the occasional window where a lamp glows faintly behind a curtain. Somewhere beyond those villages, hidden behind fences and guarded gates, entire communities are already awake. The airfield does not belong fully to the night or the morning. It exists somewhere between them. Floodlights throw pale circles across the concrete hardstands where the bombers wait. Moisture gathers along aluminum skin. Beads of water cling to rivets and panel seams. Shadows collect beneath wings large enough to shelter entire trucks. The aircraft appear motionless from a distance, but up close they reveal hundreds of small details. Oil stains darken the pavement beneath engines. The airfield is waking slowly, not with a single movement but through hundreds of separate actions occurring at once. You watch the scene from a distance where individual conversations cannot be heard. Voices blend into a low murmur beneath the wind. Shapes cross the floodlit concrete and disappear again into darkness. Nothing dramatic happens. No orders are shouted. No music swells beneath the clouds. Only work. The bombers stand waiting while hands move across metal surfaces still cold from the night. Fingers trace hydraulic lines. Fasteners are tightened. Fuel levels are checked. Instruments are inspected. Each action seems small when viewed alone. Together they form a ritual repeated so often that many participants can perform parts of it without conscious thought. The war is present here, but not in the way people often imagine. There are no front lines visible from this runway. No artillery flashes along the horizon. No advancing armies crossing fields. Instead there is preparation. Endless preparation. A kind of patient labor that stretches through darkness and daylight alike, creating the conditions under which everything else becomes possible. Beyond the floodlights, the bombers wait silently. Some have crossed the North Sea many times before. Their aluminum skins carry patches where damage has been repaired. Their engines have already survived weather, flak, and mechanical strain. Others remain newer, their surfaces cleaner, their history shorter. Standing together in the darkness, however, they appear almost identical. For now. The distinction between them will become easier to see as the months pass. Rain begins again. Not heavily. Just enough to darken jackets and leave small ripples in puddles gathering between sections of concrete. The men continue working without urgency. English weather rarely grants permission to stop. The dampness becomes another companion, as familiar as the smell of fuel or the weight of a wrench carried from one aircraft to another. The airfield has crossed an invisible threshold. Night remains present, but daylight is beginning its slow advance. And with it comes another day in a cycle that seems endless. A cycle of departures. A cycle of waiting. A cycle of return. Or, sometimes, the absence of return. Before the first bombers disappear into the cloud beyond this runway, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you find yourself returning to these quiet corners of history, where routine carries as much weight as battle, and where the people who remain behind reveal a different face of war. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. The morning grows gradually rather than suddenly. Clouds drift low across the airfield, carrying the pale color of wet paper. The floodlights that dominated the darkness begin to lose their authority as natural light spreads across the concrete. Shadows retreat beneath vehicles and wings. Details emerge everywhere. A forgotten ladder beside a maintenance bay. Fresh tire tracks crossing damp pavement. A row of bicycles leaning against the wall of a corrugated building where night shift workers will soon finish their duties. The bombers seem larger now. In darkness they were shapes. In daylight they become structures. Vast machines assembled from thousands of parts that must continue functioning together despite vibration, weather, altitude, and enemy fire. Their presence dominates the landscape. They occupy the airfield the way ships occupy a harbor, each carrying its own history, its own crew, its own uncertain future. Around them, the ground crews continue their work. A mechanic climbs onto a wing slick with moisture and kneels beside an engine nacelle. Nearby, another man studies a maintenance log while holding a mug that has long since stopped steaming. A fuel truck moves slowly across the dispersal area. Their world is measured less by battles than by cycles, less by singular moments than by repetition. You begin to notice how much of the airfield depends upon memory. Not official memory recorded in reports and ledgers, but practical memory carried by individuals. A mechanic remembers which engine has been behaving strangely. A crew chief notices a vibration that someone unfamiliar might overlook. A driver learns which roads become flooded after heavy rain. Experience settles quietly into habits, becoming nearly invisible even to those who possess it. The war rewards such knowledge. Aircraft return from missions carrying problems that do not always announce themselves clearly. A loose connection hidden behind a panel. A stress fracture beginning to form along a structural member. Damage concealed beneath layers of dirt, oil, and weather. Finding such flaws often depends less upon equipment than upon familiarity. The men learn the aircraft the way farmers learn fields or sailors learn coastlines. Not through theory alone. Through repetition. Morning advances further. Engines begin starting across the airfield. One after another they awaken with smoke, vibration, and sound powerful enough to shake water from nearby surfaces. Propellers blur into circles. Exhaust drifts through damp air. Ground crews stand beside machines that seem almost alive now, transformed from silent metal into something restless and energetic. The noise becomes enormous. Yet even this eventually becomes ordinary. One of the quiet transformations of war occurs when extraordinary things stop feeling extraordinary. The human mind adapts with remarkable speed. Sounds that once demanded attention become background noise. Risks that once inspired fear become accepted facts. The impossible slowly becomes routine. On bomber bases throughout Britain, that transformation happens every day. The first time a man stands beside 4 engines running at full power, the experience can feel overwhelming. Months later, he may barely glance upward while continuing a conversation. Familiarity reshapes perception. Repetition alters scale. The aircraft themselves undergo a similar transformation. Runways carved into landscapes that had known cattle, hedgerows, and village footpaths long before the arrival of military engineers. Yet beneath that temporary appearance exists an immense and complicated system designed to sustain operations on a scale difficult to comprehend from any single viewpoint. The airfield functions as a town whose purpose never changes. People sleep here, eat here, work here, argue here, and grow tired here. Vehicles move constantly between specialized locations. Supplies arrive from distant ports and factories. Information flows through offices. Fuel passes through pipelines and storage tanks. Every structure serves a purpose connected to keeping aircraft flying. Most days begin long before sunrise. Barracks lights appear while darkness still covers the runways. Men dress quietly beside rows of metal bunks. Boots touch cold floors. Water splashes into basins. Outside, the weather already influences the mood of the day before anyone has received official forecasts. Wind rattles windows. Rain taps against roofs. Fog settles across open ground. The sky itself becomes part of the machinery governing daily life. You watch the base awaken gradually. The process resembles a chain reaction moving through separate corners of the installation. Kitchen staff begin work. Drivers report to motor pools. Maintenance personnel collect equipment. Clerks unlock offices and prepare paperwork that will follow aircraft throughout the day. No single individual sees the entire process. Each person observes only a fragment. Together, those fragments create an operational rhythm capable of supporting thousands of people and dozens of aircraft. The bomber crews occupy a visible place within that rhythm, but they are not its entirety. Far more people remain on the ground than ever leave it. The public imagination often focuses upon pilots because pilots travel toward danger in ways that are immediately understandable. Yet bomber operations depend upon layers of labor extending far beyond the cockpit. Specific mornings become difficult to separate from one another. Rainy airfields merge into memory. One inspection resembles the next. One departure resembles the last. Only later do certain details remain. A particular aircraft. A particular crew. A particular morning beneath low clouds. For now, however, the base exists entirely within the present tense. Aircraft need servicing. Fuel must be delivered. Reports must be completed. Weather must be monitored. The war advances through practical requirements. Far beyond the perimeter fence, farmers continue working fields that border the installation. Trains cross the countryside carrying passengers and freight. Church bells occasionally drift across the landscape when conditions allow sound to travel. Civilian life and military life coexist uneasily, separated by fences yet sharing the same weather, the same roads, and the same horizon. The bomber bases have become part of England without ever fully belonging to it. American voices fill villages where local accents have existed for centuries. Cafes serve unfamiliar customers. Roads designed for horse carts and farm traffic now accommodate military convoys. Entire communities adjust to the presence of young men who arrived from another continent carrying different habits, different slang, and different expectations. The war changes landscapes gradually, not only through destruction, through occupation, through adaptation, through the quiet accumulation of routines that eventually begin feeling normal. And here, on this damp morning among the bombers, normality is already taking shape. The aircraft wait. The crews work. The clouds drift overhead. Another day prepares to begin its long journey through the machinery of war. As the morning matures, the airfield settles into a rhythm that is neither hurried nor relaxed. Activity increases everywhere, yet much of it unfolds with a deliberate pace shaped by necessity. Hastiness carries risks. An overlooked fastener, a missed inspection point, a fuel contamination issue, or an improperly secured panel can accompany an aircraft across an entire continent. The men working around the bombers understand this, even if they rarely speak about it directly. Their caution is not dramatic. It is habitual. The weather office becomes one of the quiet centers around which the day begins to organize itself. Inside rooms filled with maps, instruments, and reports arriving from distant stations, specialists attempt to understand conditions stretching far beyond the horizon. Clouds over the North Sea. Visibility above occupied Europe. Winds at altitude. Temperatures that may affect engines or formations. The information arrives incomplete. It always does. Weather remains one of the few forces in the war that answers to no command structure. Outside, clouds continue moving overhead in slow formations. Ground crews often develop an intimate awareness of the sky without ever leaving the ground. They learn to recognize changes that may influence a mission. Fog lingering too long after sunrise. Winds strengthening from unexpected directions. Rain arriving earlier than forecast. The sky becomes something observed constantly yet never controlled. You begin to notice how often people look upward. Not dramatically. Not with anxiety. Simply because so much depends upon what happens above them. Near the maintenance areas, vehicles move steadily between aircraft. Fuel trucks approach one bomber and then another. Equipment trailers rattle across concrete. Men carry toolboxes that seem heavier with every passing hour. Their work rarely produces a single visible achievement. Instead, it prevents failures. Success often appears identical to nothing happening at all. This is one of the peculiar realities of maintenance. The better it is performed, the less noticeable it becomes. A properly functioning engine attracts little attention. A secure hydraulic line earns no headlines. A successful repair disappears into the larger operation. Recognition usually arrives only when something goes wrong. Its aluminum skin reflects a muted version of the morning. Along sections of the fuselage, patches reveal earlier encounters with flak or mechanical strain. The aircraft carries traces of previous journeys even while preparing for future ones. In this way, every bomber becomes a record of accumulated experience written in metal rather than ink. The airfield contains many such records. Some aircraft appear almost pristine. Others display evidence of long service. Repaired sections. Replacement panels. Subtle variations in paint. The differences remain invisible to casual observers but immediately recognizable to those who work among them every day. Ground crews learn to read these details the way librarians read worn book spines or sailors read weathered hulls. Time leaves marks on machines. The men notice them because noticing has become part of survival. As midday approaches, activity spreads beyond the maintenance areas into the broader life of the base. Mess halls fill and empty. Offices process reports. Drivers move supplies between storage areas. Communications personnel manage a steady flow of information. Hundreds of separate routines unfold simultaneously, each contributing to a larger system that few individuals ever see in its entirety. The airfield resembles an organism, not because it is alive, but because so many independent functions operate together. Fuel, information, labor, transportation, maintenance, food, weather, and planning circulate continuously through the installation. Remove enough of those functions and the entire structure begins to weaken. Yet most participants experience only a narrow portion of that complexity. A mechanic focuses on engines. A driver focuses on deliveries. A clerk focuses on paperwork. Each person understands a small territory within a much larger landscape. You watch this landscape reveal itself slowly through repetition. A truck follows the same route it followed yesterday. Workers gather in familiar places. Aircraft occupy the same hardstands. The scenery changes very little from one day to the next. At first glance, such repetition might suggest stillness. Yet beneath the surface, countless small adjustments occur constantly. Parts are replaced. Schedules shift. Personnel rotate. Aircraft arrive with new problems and leave with old ones resolved. The appearance of sameness conceals continuous movement. That concealment is important. During the early stages of life on a bomber base, the routine itself becomes a source of reassurance. The familiar sequence of tasks creates a sense of order within a conflict defined by uncertainty. Men learn where they are expected to be. They learn what is expected of them. They learn how the day unfolds. The system appears dependable, predictable, manageable. For now. Rainwater dries slowly from the concrete wherever weak sunlight manages to break through the overcast. The airfield continues preparing itself. Always preparing. Always expecting movement. Always looking toward a horizon that remains hidden beyond the weather. And somewhere beyond that horizon, another mission is already beginning to take shape. The sound of departure. The morning arrives differently when a mission has been scheduled. Nothing visible changes at first. The same clouds drift above the runways. The same damp wind crosses the open ground. The same maintenance crews move between aircraft carrying tools and paperwork. Yet beneath those familiar sights exists a tension difficult to describe. A subtle tightening of the airfield's rhythm as hundreds of people begin orienting themselves toward a single event. Departure. Long before engines start, the base begins preparing for movement. In briefing rooms, crews gather beneath maps covered with symbols, lines, and destinations. Outside, vehicles continue crossing the concrete roads between hangars and dispersal points. Fuel trucks complete final deliveries. Armorers finish loading bombs whose weight settles heavily into aircraft waiting motionless on their hardstands. Every action appears ordinary when viewed alone. Together they create momentum. The airfield is becoming focused. You can feel it even from a distance. Conversations shorten. Movements become slightly more purposeful. Time begins organizing itself around schedules rather than tasks. A maintenance crew may spend hours repairing an aircraft during an ordinary week, but on mission mornings every remaining minute acquires value. There is always another inspection to complete, another document to verify, another detail requiring attention before the bombers leave the ground. The mechanics know these aircraft well by now. At least well enough to recognize their individual peculiarities. One engine tends to consume more oil than expected. Another aircraft develops recurring electrical faults during wet weather. A third has survived enough damage that some men quietly wonder how much longer luck will continue protecting it. Officially, the bombers remain serial numbers. Unofficially, they become familiar presences occupying daily life. A crew chief walks slowly around a B-17 while carrying a clipboard dampened by mist. He pauses occasionally to inspect a panel or study a repair completed during previous days. Nothing dramatic appears wrong. Most mornings nothing dramatic does. The aircraft stands ready. Yet experience encourages caution. Mechanical failure rarely announces itself politely. It emerges from small oversights accumulating over time. The inspection continues. Nearby, another mechanic leans against a wheel assembly while checking hydraulic connections. Across the dispersal area, a radio technician emerges from the belly of an aircraft carrying equipment that will be tested again before departure. The work proceeds quietly despite the growing importance of the day. War often appears loud in retrospect. Much of it unfolds in silence. The bomber crews eventually emerge from their briefing rooms. They cross the airfield in groups, carrying flight gear and private thoughts. Some speak casually. Others remain quiet. The contrast attracts little attention because everyone develops personal rituals around departure. There are men who joke before missions. Men who smoke. Men who review procedures repeatedly. Men who prefer silence. The ground crews notice these habits without necessarily discussing them. Familiarity develops naturally when people share the same environment for months. Mechanics learn the faces of pilots. Drivers recognize navigators. Armorers exchange brief greetings with bombardiers whose names they may never know fully. Relationships form not through dramatic conversations but through repeated encounters. The same faces appear again and again, until one day they do not. For now, however, the pattern remains intact. The crews climb aboard their aircraft. Ground personnel continue moving beneath wings and around landing gear. Final checks proceed. The bombers remain motionless, but anticipation now fills every corner of the airfield. The day has reached the point where preparation begins giving way to action. Clouds drift overhead in uneven layers. Weather remains a constant companion to bomber operations. It influences visibility, navigation, formation assembly, and return routes. It delays missions, cancels them, complicates them, shapes them. Ground crews spend countless hours studying aircraft while simultaneously watching the sky, aware that success depends partly upon conditions no one can control. The wind strengthens slightly. Loose canvas covers flutter against metal surfaces. A mechanic secures one before stepping away. Across the field, engines begin turning over. The sound arrives gradually. One aircraft first, then another, then several more. Propellers rotate slowly before accelerating into blurred circles. Exhaust smoke curls through damp air. The quiet atmosphere of maintenance and preparation begins dissolving beneath mechanical noise powerful enough to dominate the landscape. Vibrations spread through concrete. Birds rise from nearby hedgerows. Windows tremble inside buildings positioned close to taxiways. The bombers are waking. You watch ground crews continue working around machines that have suddenly become energetic and impatient. Signals are exchanged. Procedures are followed. Men move confidently through routines performed countless times before. Familiarity allows them to function within noise that would overwhelm outsiders. The aircraft no longer resemble static objects. They resemble forces preparing for release. One by one, bombers begin leaving their hardstands. Heavy wheels roll across concrete darkened by recent rain. Engines generate a continuous roar that settles across the countryside. Villagers living beyond the perimeter fence have heard these sounds many times before. Farmers working nearby fields recognize them instantly. The airfield announces itself not through sight but through vibration. Departure is beginning. And for the ground crews, departure marks the start of a different kind of work. Not flying. Not fighting. Waiting. The aircraft moves steadily toward the runways while personnel remain behind, watching familiar machines disappear into the machinery of the mission cycle once again. The bombers have become the center of the airfield's purpose. Soon they will become its absence. The line of bombers stretches across the taxiways like a slow-moving river of metal. Each aircraft advances according to a carefully managed sequence. Distances are maintained. Signals are exchanged. Engines continue their relentless roar beneath the low English sky. What appears simple from afar is the product of countless procedures designed to move enormous machines safely through limited space. The ground crews know most of these movements by memory. Many have watched them hundreds of times. Yet familiarity does not eliminate attention. Eyes continue following aircraft as they taxi past maintenance areas and operations buildings. Men pause briefly in their work to observe departures. Not because the sight is unusual, but because it has become part of the rhythm through which they understand the day. The bombers move toward the runways. The people who prepared them remain behind. This separation occurs so often that it risks appearing ordinary. In some ways, it is ordinary. Routine eventually absorbs almost everything. Yet the moment contains a quiet transition that repeats itself across every mission. Responsibility begins shifting from one group of people to another. The aircraft no longer belong to the mechanics. They belong to the crews. Soon they will belong to the weather, to navigation, to chance, and to circumstances unfolding far beyond the horizon. You watch as the first bomber reaches the runway threshold and pauses. The engines continue running at high power. Exhaust drifts behind the aircraft in wavering streams. Ground personnel positioned nearby exchange final signals. Then the bomber begins accelerating. At first the movement appears almost reluctant. The aircraft gathers speed slowly beneath its tremendous weight. Bombs, fuel, ammunition, equipment, and crew combine into a burden that must be carried into the air. Wheels remain on the ground longer than intuition expects. The runway stretches ahead. The engines continue pulling. Then, gradually, the aircraft separates itself from the earth. The landing gear retracts. The bomber climbs. Another follows. Then another. And another. Throughout the morning the process repeats until the sky begins filling with aircraft moving toward assembly points beyond the airfield. Formations gather above the countryside. Tiny silver shapes emerge between layers of cloud. Engines merge into a distant and continuous sound that lingers long after individual aircraft become impossible to distinguish. Eventually the bombers disappear. Some vanish into weather. Others fade into distance. All leave behind the same thing. Silence. Not complete silence. Airfields never become truly silent. Trucks continue moving. Maintenance shops remain active. Offices continue operating. Yet compared with the concentrated noise of departure, the base undergoes a noticeable transformation. A pressure releases. The great machines that dominated the morning have departed. The airfield exhales. And waiting begins. This waiting differs from ordinary waiting. It possesses no fixed duration visible to those remaining behind. Mission schedules provide estimates. Weather alters them. Mechanical problems alter them. Enemy action alters them. The exact moment of return always remains uncertain. Ground crews learn to live inside that uncertainty. Some return immediately to routine maintenance. Other aircraft still require attention. Equipment must be repaired. Supplies must be organized. Reports must be completed. The base remains a functioning institution regardless of how many bombers currently occupy the sky. Work continues because work always continues. Yet departure leaves an absence that can be felt. The hardstands stand empty now. Places occupied only hours earlier by familiar aircraft have become open spaces reflecting cloud and sunlight. Chocks remain where wheels once rested. Small oil stains remain on concrete. Maintenance ladders stand unused beside vacant positions. The physical traces of the bombers persist even after the aircraft themselves have vanished. You begin to understand how much of life on these bases revolves around presence and absence. The aircraft arrive. The aircraft leave. The aircraft return. Or fail to return. Everything else organizes itself around those movements. Near one maintenance shed, a mechanic sits briefly on an overturned crate while drinking coffee that has grown lukewarm. The moment lasts only a few minutes before another task demands attention. Yet such pauses become part of the airfield's hidden rhythm. Time stretches differently after departure. The urgency of preparation gives way to a quieter form of anticipation. The sky becomes important again. Not because of weather forecasts now. Because the aircraft are somewhere inside it. Across occupied Europe, events unfold beyond the sight of everyone remaining on the ground. Bombers navigate through cloud formations. Crews monitor instruments. Engines maintain their steady labor. Anti-aircraft batteries prepare to fire. Fighter aircraft wait on distant airfields. Entire worlds of experience develop beyond the horizon. The ground crews witness none of it. Their war unfolds through fragments. An aircraft that returns damaged. A report describing mechanical issues. A missing crew. A delayed arrival. The larger story often remains invisible. Perhaps that invisibility contributes to the peculiar emotional character of waiting. Human imagination fills empty spaces. Men speculate quietly about weather conditions, about navigation difficulties, about whether familiar aircraft are performing well. Most thoughts remain unspoken. The routines of the base discourage excessive reflection. There is always work. Work provides structure. Structure helps time move forward. By afternoon, the airfield has settled into a different mood entirely from the one that existed before departure. The noise has faded. Vehicles move at a slower pace. Maintenance crews focus on tasks impossible to complete during mission preparation. Offices process paperwork beneath the steady ticking of clocks. The landscape itself seems larger without bombers occupying every available space. Cloud shadows drift across the runways. Wind bends grass along the edges of the concrete. Somewhere beyond sight, hundreds of miles away, the aircraft continue their journey. Here on the ground, however, the day enters its longest phase. The phase that cannot be hurried. The phase that arrives after every departure and before every return. The airfield waits. And little by little, the people upon it learn how much of their lives will be spent doing exactly the same. The empty hardstands. By mid-afternoon, the airfield feels larger than it did at dawn. The runways remain the same length. The buildings stand where they stood before. The perimeter roads continue tracing familiar routes through the countryside. Yet the departure of dozens of bombers alters the emotional geography of the base. Spaces once occupied by engines, crews, vehicles, and activity now sit exposed beneath drifting cloud. The hardstands draw attention first. Earlier in the day, they held aircraft waiting for departure. Now many stand empty except for the traces left behind. Chocks rest where wheels once stood. Maintenance platforms cast narrow shadows across vacant concrete. Small puddles reflect patches of sky. The absence of the bombers becomes a physical presence of its own. You find yourself looking at the spaces rather than the objects that occupied them. The airfield enters a different state once the aircraft are gone. Not inactive. Not idle. Simply altered. A driver guides a truck between maintenance buildings carrying equipment needed elsewhere on the base. Nearby, mechanics continue servicing aircraft that were not assigned to the mission. Radios crackle intermittently inside operations offices. Mess halls prepare afternoon meals. Across the installation, hundreds of tasks proceed according to schedules that continue regardless of events unfolding beyond the horizon. The war has not paused, only changed location. For the ground crews, this transition becomes one of the defining experiences of bomber base life. Their responsibilities are immense during preparation. Their responsibilities become equally important after return. Yet between those periods exists a stretch of time occupied largely by uncertainty. Not complete uncertainty. Reports occasionally arrive. Weather updates are received. Communications pass through official channels. But information travels unevenly, and much of what truly matters remains unavailable until the bombers come home. The men learn to exist alongside incomplete knowledge. Near a maintenance workshop, several mechanics gather around an engine removed from an aircraft weeks earlier. The machine rests on a support frame surrounded by tools and components. Work continues methodically. Measurements are taken. Parts are inspected. The odors blend together until they become inseparable from memory itself. Years later, many veterans will recall specific scents more clearly than specific dates. The human mind often preserves atmosphere more faithfully than chronology. You watch a mechanic wipe grease from his hands while standing beside an open workshop door. Beyond him, the countryside stretches outward beneath shifting clouds. Fields occupy the landscape much as they have for generations. Sheep graze behind stone walls. Trees bend in the wind. The war exists here, but it shares space with older rhythms that continue despite global conflict. This contrast shapes life on bomber bases throughout Britain. The extraordinary and the ordinary coexist constantly. A mission may be crossing hostile territory at this very moment. Meanwhile, a farmer repairs a fence less than a mile away. A bomber formation may be approaching enemy defenses. Meanwhile, someone in a nearby village is purchasing bread or posting a letter. The proximity of normal life makes wartime routines feel stranger rather than less significant. The ground crews inhabit both worlds simultaneously. Military schedules dominate their days. Yet English villages remain visible beyond the perimeter fences. Church bells occasionally drift across the fields when conditions are right. Trains continue crossing the countryside. Seasons continue changing. Nature observes its own calendar. War observes another. As afternoon stretches onward, shadows begin shifting across the airfield. Buildings that seemed bright at midday now cast longer silhouettes across concrete surfaces. The weather changes again. A brief shower arrives from the west, rattling against roofs before passing onward across the landscape. No one appears surprised. Weather changes frequently enough to become part of the routine. Men pull jackets tighter. Work continues. The rain departs. Work continues. The sun emerges briefly through a gap in the cloud cover. Work continues. The persistence of routine forms one of the hidden foundations of military life. Grand events may dominate historical memory, but institutions survive through repetition. Light softens along the edges of buildings. Reflections disappear from puddles as clouds thicken overhead. The air cools slightly, carrying dampness from nearby fields and hedgerows. Men who have spent the day working outdoors begin noticing the chill settling into jackets and gloves. The waiting changes with the light. Afternoon waiting feels practical. Evening waiting feels personal. The distinction is difficult to measure, but many who served on bomber bases would have recognized it immediately. During the middle of the day, there is always another task demanding attention. Equipment must be organized. Repairs must be completed. Reports must be processed. Activity creates distance between the mind and uncertainty. As evening approaches, that distance becomes harder to maintain. The sky begins reclaiming attention. You notice it happening almost unconsciously. A mechanic emerging from a workshop glances upward before lighting a cigarette. A driver pauses beside his vehicle for a few moments longer than necessary. Men standing outside operations buildings study the cloud cover while pretending to focus on other matters. No one announces what they are doing. They simply look. The horizon acquires significance. Somewhere beyond it, aircraft are moving through air that those on the ground can neither see nor influence. Entire missions unfold beyond observation. Weather systems form and dissipate. Engines continue their labor. Crews navigate unfamiliar skies. Decisions are made. Risks are taken. The people remaining behind experience none of it directly. Instead, they inhabit a strange space between knowledge and ignorance. They know where the aircraft were intended to go. They know approximately when the aircraft should return. They know the dangers involved. Everything else remains uncertain. This uncertainty becomes one of the defining emotional conditions of bomber base life. Unlike infantrymen advancing across terrain or sailors confronting weather at sea, ground crews often encounter war indirectly. Its consequences arrive before its explanations. Damage appears before stories. Absence appears before confirmation. The airfield grows quieter, not silent. Those gaps become familiar companions. You begin to understand that much of military life involves functioning despite incomplete information rather than because of complete information. The men learn to live within uncertainty the way sailors learn to live with changing tides. Not comfortably, simply consistently. Across the airfield, maintenance crews quietly prepare for aircraft that have not yet arrived. Spare parts are organized. Equipment is positioned where it will be needed. Fueling procedures are reviewed. Vehicles are made ready. The preparations possess a hopeful quality without ever becoming sentimental. Preparation assumes return. Preparation must assume return. Institutions cannot function otherwise. Absence looks backward. Expectation looks forward. The airfield increasingly concerns itself with what comes next. At the far edge of the base, several men stand beside a vehicle while speaking quietly. Their conversation is impossible to hear from a distance. Perhaps they are discussing schedules. Perhaps weather. Perhaps something entirely unrelated to the war. Human beings rarely think about a single subject continuously, even during extraordinary times. Life persists within larger events. That persistence becomes one of the quiet truths underlying the entire bomber campaign. People continue eating meals, writing letters, sharing jokes, complaining about rain, thinking about home. The machinery of war surrounds them, but it does not completely replace ordinary human concerns. Perhaps that is why waiting feels so complicated. Waiting leaves room for thought. Thought often drifts elsewhere, toward families, toward future plans, toward memories carried across oceans, toward possibilities that exist beyond runways and bombers and maintenance schedules. Then a sound arrives. Faint, distant, almost indistinguishable from the wind at first. Heads lift. Conversations pause. The airfield listens. Far beyond the horizon, somewhere hidden by distance and weather, engines may be approaching. Or perhaps not. It is too early to know. Yet the waiting has entered a new phase. The empty hardstands remain empty for now. But not forever. The people who work among them understand this rhythm intimately. Departure creates absence. Absence creates waiting. And waiting eventually gives way to something else. The first distant hints of return. Beneath returning wings. The sound becomes clearer as darkness settles across the airfield. At first it remains uncertain. A distant vibration carried unevenly by wind and cloud. Men pause in doorways and along service roads, listening without fully committing their attention. Experience teaches caution. Sound travels strangely across open countryside. You watch men emerge from workshops where they have spent much of the afternoon. Others leave operations buildings carrying clipboards and flashlights. Drivers move trucks toward designated locations. Mechanics collect tools they may need within the next hour. The airfield begins transforming itself once more. It has performed this transformation many times before. Yet it never becomes entirely routine. The first aircraft appears through a break in the cloud cover. Only a silhouette at first. A dark shape crossing an evening sky already surrendering to night. Then another appears. And another. Yet it repeats itself across every mission. A navigator climbs down. A pilot follows. Gunners emerge from cramped positions occupied for hours. Men stretch stiff muscles. Exchange brief words. Gather equipment. Life continues. For now. The floodlights cast pale circles across damp concrete while aircraft continue arriving from the darkness. Some land smoothly. Others approach more cautiously. Ground crews move steadily between machines. Inspections begin almost immediately. The bombers have barely stopped moving before the next cycle starts. Fuel levels are checked. Damage is noted. Mechanical concerns are recorded. Questions are asked. Answers are gathered. The war wastes little time. You begin to see how quickly absence transforms back into presence. The empty hardstands that dominated the afternoon gradually fill again. Aircraft occupy familiar spaces. Vehicles gather around them. Personnel move beneath wings carrying tools and equipment. The landscape reassembles itself. Yet not perfectly. Not every space fills immediately. Some hardstands remain empty. Most people avoid looking at them for too long. The evening remains young. Aircraft are still arriving. There is no reason to assume the worst. Not yet. The airfield continues listening for engines beyond the horizon while floodlights shine through mist and darkness. Bombers return one after another. Ground crews move among them. Familiar routines resume beneath returning wings. And somewhere within those routines, the first signs of a deeper awareness begin taking shape. An awareness that aircraft do not always come home unchanged. And sometimes do not come home at all. The arrivals continue well into the evening. Darkness deepens above the airfield while engines emerge from it one after another, descending through cloud and mist toward the runways below. The process unfolds slowly enough that anticipation never fully disappears. Each landing resolves one uncertainty while leaving countless others intact. One aircraft returns safely. Another remains somewhere beyond the horizon. The waiting changes shape rather than ending. Ground crews learn this quickly. A mission is not truly over when the first bombers arrive. It is not even over when most of them arrive. Completion remains elusive until every expected aircraft has either returned or ceased to be expected. Between those two conditions exists a long and uncomfortable stretch of ambiguity. The airfield inhabits that ambiguity every time the bombers come home. Near one hardstand, mechanics gather around an aircraft whose crew reported engine trouble during the return flight. The bomber landed safely, but only after hours of concern carried silently across occupied skies and open water. Now the problem belongs to the ground. Panels are opened. Flashlights illuminate machinery still warm from operation. The inspection begins immediately. There is a peculiar intimacy to post-mission maintenance. Aircraft that appeared distant and almost untouchable while crossing the sky become physical objects once more. Men place their hands upon metal surfaces still carrying the warmth of engines. They examine components that only hours earlier were functioning thousands of feet above the earth. The transition from abstraction to reality occurs remarkably quickly. The aircraft return carrying evidence. Not only damage. Evidence of strain. Evidence of weather. Evidence of time spent operating near the limits of design. A bomber may complete a mission successfully and still arrive altered. Rivets loosen. Systems wear. Small imperfections accumulate. Most remain invisible to casual observers. Ground crews spend their lives learning how to notice them. The work requires patience more than drama. A mechanic studies an engine housing illuminated by a portable lamp. Another records observations in a maintenance log. Nearby, someone examines damage caused by fragments that struck the fuselage during the mission. None of these activities attract crowds. No one pauses to celebrate routine competence. Yet routine competence keeps aircraft flying. Again and again. Night settles fully across the countryside. Beyond the perimeter fence, villages disappear into darkness. Farmhouses glow faintly through distant trees. Many of the men working tonight have already been awake since before dawn. Some worked late into the previous evening. Others will continue long after midnight. Wartime schedules rarely align neatly with human preferences. Aircraft arrive when they arrive. Repairs occur when they must occur. Fatigue becomes a permanent companion. You can see it in the way people move. Not weakness. Not collapse. Simply weariness carried with familiarity. A mechanic climbs a ladder more slowly than he would have 6 months earlier. A driver stretches his back before lifting equipment. A clerk rubs tired eyes while reviewing reports beneath harsh electric light. The strain accumulates gradually, settling into bodies the same way moisture settles into the English landscape. The airfield continues functioning. That is what matters. Institutional life possesses remarkable momentum. Individuals become tired. Systems continue. Personnel rotate through shifts. Tasks pass from one set of hands to another. The machinery of war absorbs fatigue and converts it into routine. Yet fatigue leaves traces. It alters conversations, shortens tempers, deepens silences, encourages reflection during quiet moments. Near the operations building, information regarding returning aircraft continues arriving throughout the evening. Names are checked. Numbers are updated. Expected arrivals become confirmed arrivals. The process unfolds methodically, without visible emotion. Administrative work often conceals emotional weight beneath procedure. A mark beside a number. A line entered onto a form. A report filed. The actions appear ordinary. Their meaning is not. The ground crews rarely possess a complete picture of any mission. They know aircraft. They know maintenance concerns. They know schedules. What they often encounter first are consequences rather than narratives. A damaged bomber. An exhausted crew. A delayed arrival. An empty hardstand. The larger story arrives later, if it arrives at all. This partial knowledge shapes perception. Men learn to focus on immediate realities because immediate realities can be addressed. Damage can be repaired. Fuel can be delivered. Equipment can be replaced. The future remains uncertain, but the next task usually reveals itself clearly enough. Perhaps that is why the routines become so important. Routine provides structure where certainty cannot. Another bomber lands. Then another. The airfield slowly fills. The empty spaces that dominated the afternoon begin disappearing beneath aircraft and activity. Familiar machines reclaim familiar positions. Vehicles gather around them. Crews emerge. Mechanics begin work. The cycle appears complete. Almost. You notice it first through absence rather than presence. One hardstand remains vacant. Then another. Most people continue working. No one rushes toward conclusions. Like the fatigue already resting upon everyone who continues working beneath the floodlights. The bombers have returned. Most of them. And for the first time, the airfield begins revealing a truth that will shape everything that follows. The cycle does not simply repeat. Each repetition leaves something behind. Familiar aircraft. Morning returns beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Rain fell during the night. Water collects along the edges of the runways and settles in shallow depressions scattered across the airfield. The bombers stand where they were left after the previous evening's arrivals, their surfaces damp with moisture, their engines silent once more. From a distance, the scene appears almost unchanged from countless mornings before it. Yet the airfield never truly repeats itself. The illusion of sameness conceals constant alteration. Every aircraft carries a slightly different condition than it carried yesterday. Every maintenance log contains new entries. Every crew arrives with experiences accumulated during the previous mission. The base appears stable because change occurs gradually, distributed across hundreds of small details rather than announced through dramatic transformation. The ground crews become experts at noticing those details. A mechanic walking toward a familiar bomber begins observing long before he reaches it. The aircraft occupies its usual position on the hardstand. Its outline remains unchanged. Its wings still stretch across the damp morning air. Yet something is different. A temporary patch added after the previous mission. A new oil stain beneath one engine. A section awaiting closer inspection. The aircraft has returned, but it has not returned unchanged. You watch the mechanic approach with the quiet concentration of someone greeting an old acquaintance. The relationship between ground crews and aircraft develops slowly. At first, a bomber is simply another machine assigned to another position. Over time, familiarity accumulates. Men work around the same aircraft repeatedly. They learn recurring faults. They remember previous repairs. They begin recognizing small irregularities almost immediately. The aircraft acquires a history. Not an official history. A practical one. The sort of history preserved through memory rather than documentation. Near the maintenance area, several crew chiefs discuss the condition of aircraft that returned during the previous evening. Their conversation remains technical. Engine performance. Structural concerns. Maintenance priorities. Yet beneath the practical language exists something else. Recognition. Each bomber has become known. Not loved. Not romanticized. Simply known. The distinction matters. Ground crews spend enough time around these machines to develop familiarity without illusion. They understand the aircraft's strengths because they also understand its weaknesses. They know which systems require constant attention, which engines demand careful observation, which recurring problems refuse to disappear entirely. Familiarity creates a different form of attachment than admiration. It creates responsibility. Across the base, maintenance activities begin unfolding once again. Engine panels open. Inspection teams move methodically across aircraft surfaces. Ladders appear beside fuselages. Tools emerge from storage areas. The routines remain recognizable, yet the emotional atmosphere has shifted subtly from earlier chapters. The waiting has produced consequences. The aircraft are no longer preparing for unknown futures. They are carrying visible pasts. AB-24 stands near the edge of the dispersal area with damage along portions of its fuselage. The repairs are entirely achievable. Nothing about the aircraft suggests imminent retirement. Yet the marks remain visible enough to attract attention. Fragments struck here. Pressure-stressed metal there. Somewhere over Europe, forces invisible to the men standing beside the aircraft left physical evidence behind. The bomber has become a messenger. Ground crews learn to read these messages. Not perfectly. Not completely. But well enough. A torn section of aluminum suggests one set of circumstances. A damaged control surface suggests another. An engine requiring unusual attention tells its own story. The aircraft communicate through condition rather than language. The men become translators. Clouds drift low across the airfield while work continues beneath them. The weather encourages close attention to immediate surroundings. Visibility remains limited. The horizon appears distant and indistinct. Aircraft dominate the landscape because little else can be seen clearly. Perhaps that contributes to the growing familiarity. The bombers occupy so much of daily life. Morning begins beside them. Evening often ends beside them. Meals, weather, conversations, and responsibilities all unfold around their presence. Months pass. Seasons change. Personnel rotate. The aircraft remain. Or many of them do. A crew chief pauses beside one bomber while reviewing maintenance notes recorded over previous weeks. The pages contain observations so specific that outsiders might overlook their significance entirely. A recurring vibration. An electrical fault. An oil consumption pattern. Small details. Yet repeated exposure transforms small details into recognizable characteristics. The bomber develops a reputation. Not officially. Unofficially. The way people quietly discuss machines that occupy large portions of their lives. You begin to understand how familiarity reshapes perception. At the beginning of service, aircraft appeared interchangeable. Rows of bombers standing beneath rain and cloud. Now distinctions emerge everywhere. This one tends to return with engine trouble. That one has survived damage multiple times. Another has become known for reliability. The differences may not appear in official reports, but they exist vividly within collective memory. Memory itself becomes part of the maintenance process. Knowledge passes between shifts, between mechanics, between crew chiefs. Stories accompany technical observations. Experiences accumulate. Aircraft histories grow richer with every mission completed and every repair performed. The war continues, generating new demands. The aircraft continue absorbing them. And the men responsible for keeping them airborne begin noticing something increasingly difficult to ignore. The bombers are aging. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But steadily. Every mission leaves traces. Every flight consumes something. Every successful return carries a hidden cost measured in fatigue, wear, and accumulated strain. The realization does not arrive as a revelation. It emerges gradually through repetition, through familiarity, through the simple act of seeing the same aircraft every day and understanding that metal, like people, remembers what it has endured. The realization settles into the airfield slowly enough that few people can identify when it began. One morning an aircraft appears dependable. A month later the same aircraft requires more attention than before. Another develops recurring maintenance issues that refuse to disappear completely. A third returns from successive missions carrying fresh repairs layered atop older repairs. None of these changes seem significant when viewed individually. Together, however, they begin forming a pattern. The bombers are surviving. But survival is not the same thing as remaining untouched. Rain drifts across the base in thin grey curtains throughout the afternoon. Maintenance crews continue working despite the weather. Jackets darken with moisture. Tool handles become slick. Water gathers along wing surfaces before dripping steadily onto the concrete below. The aircraft endure the rain in silence. Their stillness creates an illusion of permanence. Yet the men who work among them understand better. Machines age differently than people, but they age nonetheless. Metal flexes. Engines wear. Connections loosen. Components reach limits invisible from the outside. A mechanic kneels beside an open panel while tracing a wiring bundle through the interior of a fuselage section. The task demands patience more than strength. Somewhere inside the aircraft, a problem exists. Finding it requires familiarity accumulated through months of repetition. This familiarity becomes increasingly valuable as the campaign continues. Early in the war, many maintenance tasks involve learning. Later, they involve recognition. Ground crews begin noticing symptoms before they become failures. They remember previous repairs. They recall unusual behavior observed weeks earlier. Knowledge accumulates like layers of paint applied over time, each experience covering but never entirely replacing the one beneath it. The airfield itself seems to remember. You can see it in the workshops. Shelves contain spare parts salvaged from earlier repairs. Maintenance boards display histories extending backward through previous months. Aircraft records thicken with additional entries. Even the buildings carry evidence of long use. Mud accumulates along familiar pathways. Doorways become polished by constant traffic. Workbenches bear marks left by countless tools. Nothing remains entirely unchanged. The bombers simply make that reality more visible. Near one hardstand, several mechanics examine damage sustained by an aircraft during the previous mission. The work proceeds without urgency because urgency would be wasted. The aircraft has already returned. The immediate danger has passed. What remains is the careful process of understanding what happened. A section of skin has been removed. Internal structures become visible beneath it. The damage itself appears surprisingly small when isolated from context. A hole. A bent support. A cluster of impacted metal. Yet the men studying it know how much larger the story may be. A fragment striking a few inches differently might have reached a fuel line. Another might have damaged controls. A third might have wounded a crew member. Wartime aircraft operate inside a world where outcomes often depend upon distances measured in inches. The awareness creates neither panic nor superstition. Only respect. The bombers continue flying because countless narrow margins continue holding. As afternoon passes into evening, the airfield enters another familiar cycle. Maintenance work progresses steadily beneath shifting weather. Vehicles move between aircraft carrying tools, equipment, and replacement components. Reports accumulate. Decisions are made regarding priorities for the next mission. Routine continues functioning. Yet the emotional character of that routine has changed. Earlier chapters observed anticipation, then repetition. Now repetition begins revealing consequences. The ground crews no longer see only aircraft. They see histories. A bomber parked beside a maintenance shed carries months of accumulated experience. Repairs overlap older repairs. Replacement parts coexist beside original components. Damage once considered unusual becomes familiar. Familiarity itself begins reshaping perception. You watch a crew chief pause beside an aircraft before continuing his inspection. The pause lasts only seconds. Long enough to notice. Too brief to attract attention. Perhaps he is reviewing a maintenance concern. Perhaps remembering a previous mission. Perhaps simply gathering his thoughts before continuing. The distinction hardly matters. The aircraft have become repositories of memory. Every recurring problem recalls an earlier repair. Every visible patch recalls an earlier return. Every familiar imperfection connects the present moment to countless previous days spent beneath similar skies. The relationship between ground crews and aircraft grows increasingly complex because the bombers now exist somewhere between machine and companion. Not companions in a sentimental sense. Companions through repetition. Through proximity. Through shared endurance. The men spend so much time maintaining these aircraft that the boundaries between technical knowledge and personal familiarity begin blurring. A bomber that has survived dozens of missions acquires a reputation. People talk about it. Remember it. Recognize it instantly from a distance. The aircraft becomes part of the social landscape of the base. And that creates a new kind of pressure. Because familiarity makes loss more visible. The realization remains distant for now. Only a shadow at the edge of awareness. Yet it has begun appearing. Every repaired aircraft carries evidence of vulnerability. Every successful return confirms that return was never guaranteed. Every maintenance effort exists because something failed, weakened, or suffered strain. The campaign continues. The bombers continue flying. The ground crews continue repairing. But beneath the steady rhythm of daily work, a deeper understanding is taking shape. The aircraft are not simply participating in the war. They are being consumed by it. Slowly. Incrementally. One mission at a time. And the men who know them best are beginning to see the process unfold. The aircraft that keep returning. By late autumn, the airfield begins measuring time differently. Calendars still hang on office walls. Dates continue appearing on maintenance forms and operational reports. Official schedules remain organized according to days, weeks, and months. Yet among many of the ground crews, another system gradually emerges. Time becomes measured through missions. The bomber that returned with engine trouble 3 operations ago. The aircraft repaired during heavy rain before the last major sortie. The crew that completed its 20th mission earlier in the month. Memories organize themselves around departures and returns rather than conventional markers. The cycle has repeated often enough to reshape perception. Morning arrives beneath low cloud and a cold wind crossing the open runways. The season is changing now. Summer's relative warmth has disappeared. Damp air settles deeper into clothing. Hands grow stiff more quickly during outdoor work. Frost occasionally appears before sunrise, lingering along the edges of grass and concrete until daylight weakens it. The weather becomes another participant in the routine. Aircraft require additional attention. Engines respond differently. Metal contracts. Moisture finds new places to gather. The war remains the same war, yet every season alters how it is experienced. You watch mechanics moving across the dispersal area beneath jackets heavier than those worn months earlier. Their movements remain familiar. Their responsibilities remain familiar. Yet time has left its marks upon them just as surely as it has left marks upon the aircraft. Experience accumulates quietly. A newer arrival may still approach an aircraft with the careful uncertainty of someone learning a complicated environment. Older crew chiefs move differently. They recognize patterns quickly. They know where problems often appear. They understand how weather influences machinery. Knowledge has become instinct. The same transformation has occurred among the bombers. Some aircraft now possess reputations extending across the entire base. Their names may not appear officially on maintenance forms, but their histories circulate through conversation. Men recognize them from a distance. Stories accompany them. Certain bombers acquire identities shaped by survival, reliability, or stubborn persistence. One aircraft returns despite repeated damage. Another develops a reputation for dependable performance. A third seems permanently surrounded by maintenance personnel yet somehow continues flying. The distinctions become part of everyday life. Near a maintenance shed, a mechanic studies a bomber that has completed far more missions than many expected. The aircraft appears ordinary at first glance. Only closer inspection reveals the layers of history written across its structure. Replacement panels. Minor variations in paint. Evidence of repairs completed months apart. The bomber resembles a manuscript revised repeatedly over time. Nothing original remains entirely untouched. Yet the aircraft continues flying. That continuation commands a certain respect. Not because anyone believes the bomber is invincible. Quite the opposite. The men who know it best understand precisely how vulnerable it remains. They simply understand something else as well. Survival accumulates weight. Every successful return changes the way people look at an aircraft. Not dramatically. Gradually. One mission completed safely means little. 20 missions completed safely become difficult to ignore. 30 missions begin attracting attention even from those who prefer not to think in such terms. The bomber remains metal. Yet memory surrounds it. The ground crews cannot entirely prevent themselves from noticing. Humans are natural pattern seekers. They remember recurring faces, familiar places, repeated outcomes. The same tendency extends toward aircraft occupying daily life for months at a time. You begin to see it during ordinary conversations. A mechanic mentions an aircraft without needing to describe it fully. Others immediately know which bomber he means. A crew chief references a repair completed weeks earlier. Several listeners remember it. Shared familiarity transforms individual experience into collective memory. The airfield develops its own folklore. Not myths. Not exaggerations. Simply stories repeated often enough to become part of institutional culture. This bomber survived severe damage over occupied territory. That aircraft returned with 2 engines disabled. Another completed a mission despite mechanical failures that should have forced it back. The details shift slightly depending upon who tells the story. The core memory remains. Stories circulate because people need ways to organize uncertainty. The bomber campaign generates endless variables. Weather changes. Crews rotate. Missions differ. Outcomes remain unpredictable. Familiar aircraft provide points of continuity within that uncertainty. The men know where to find them. They know what they look like. They know their histories, or at least the portions of their histories visible from the ground. Cloud shadows drift across the airfield while maintenance work continues. The routine remains recognizable. Engines are inspected. Components replaced. Damage assessed. Reports completed. Yet the emotional atmosphere has shifted once again. The aircraft are no longer simply machines requiring maintenance. Nor are they merely records of accumulated damage. Some have become symbols of endurance. Not because anyone chooses them deliberately. Because repeated survival naturally attracts attention. The process occurs almost unconsciously. People begin expecting certain aircraft to return. Expecting certain crews to appear. Expecting familiar patterns to continue. Expectation creates its own risks. For expectation quietly transforms into belief. And belief can be dangerous on bomber bases. Because no amount of familiarity alters the reality waiting beyond the horizon. The war remains indifferent to reputation. Indifferent to memory. Indifferent to survival achieved yesterday. Yet human beings continue forming attachments nonetheless. The airfield cannot help itself. The cycle has repeated too many times. The aircraft have become too familiar. And familiarity is beginning to create a deeper vulnerability than any damaged engine or weakened rivet. The vulnerability of caring whether something returns. The vulnerability reveals itself most clearly through small moments. Not during ceremonies. Not through official recognition. Not through speeches. It appears in glances exchanged across a hardstand when a familiar bomber taxis home. It appears when mechanics notice a recognizable silhouette emerging through cloud and mist. It appears when a crew chief studies a returning aircraft and feels a quiet sense of relief before immediately returning to work. The feeling rarely lasts long. There is always another task waiting. Yet it exists. And by now, many of the men can no longer pretend otherwise. The aircraft matter. Not because they are machines. Because they have become part of daily life. Rain sweeps across the airfield during the afternoon in a series of passing showers. Water rattles against metal roofs and gathers in shallow pools beside workshops. Mechanics continue working beneath awnings and temporary shelter where they can find it. Others remain exposed to the weather because certain tasks cannot wait. The bombers stand motionless while the rain moves over them. From a distance they appear unchanged. Up close, every aircraft tells a different story. One carries evidence of recent repairs. Another awaits replacement components. A third seems almost remarkably intact compared with its neighbors. The contrasts become more visible as the months pass. Ground crews no longer see a collection of similar aircraft. They see individuals within a larger population. The distinction alters perception. You watch a mechanic crossing the dispersal area while carrying maintenance records beneath his arm. The rain forces him to lower his head against the wind. Around him stretches a landscape he knows intimately. Every building. Every hardstand. Every maintenance bay. Familiarity has transformed the base into something approaching a home. Not a comfortable home. Not a permanent one. But a place understood through repetition. The same process has transformed many of the aircraft. Men recognize them almost instinctively now. Certain bombers draw attention whenever they appear. A heavily repaired aircraft returning once again. A veteran machine that has survived far longer than expected. An aircraft associated with a crew known throughout the base. Stories accumulate around them. Memory settles upon them. The phenomenon remains unofficial because official systems concern themselves with operational realities rather than emotional ones. Aircraft are tracked through serial numbers, maintenance records, mission counts, technical evaluations. Human beings, however, track other things as well: patterns, expectations, associations. The bomber that always seems to return. The crew that always seems to smile after landing. The aircraft whose engine troubles somehow never become catastrophic. These observations occupy no formal place within military procedure. Yet they influence how people experience the campaign. As evening approaches, preparations begin for another mission cycle. Maintenance priorities are reviewed. Aircraft readiness is assessed. Equipment is organized. The process has occurred so many times that entire sections of the base seem capable of anticipating their own future movements. Routine has reached maturity. Earlier chapters observed routine emerging. Now routine governs life almost completely. The men understand where they belong within the larger system. They know what tomorrow will require. They know how the cycle functions. Uncertainty remains, but it exists inside familiar boundaries. The familiarity provides comfort. It also creates danger, because routine encourages assumptions. The bomber that returned yesterday will return tomorrow. The crew seen this morning will be seen again. The aircraft occupying a hardstand tonight will occupy it next week. Such assumptions rarely announce themselves openly. They develop quietly through repetition. 1,000 successful outcomes create confidence. Confidence gradually hardens into expectation. The airfield itself seems to participate in this process. Certain aircraft become permanent features of the landscape. Their presence feels natural. Their absence becomes difficult to imagine. Men pass them daily, work around them daily, refer to them casually in conversation. The bombers become woven into the texture of ordinary life. And ordinary life possesses remarkable power. Human beings adapt to almost anything if given enough time. Even uncertainty, even danger, even war. The adaptation allows institutions to function. It allows people to continue working despite conditions that might otherwise prove unbearable. Yet adaptation carries a hidden cost. The more familiar something becomes, the more noticeable its disappearance becomes as well. The realization remains incomplete, only partially visible. A storm gathering beyond the horizon rather than directly overhead. Still, the signs are present. The ground crews have begun investing pieces of themselves in the cycle. Not intentionally, not dramatically, through repetition, through memory, through simple human attachment formed over months of shared experience. A bomber returns often enough and people begin expecting its return. A crew survives often enough and people begin assuming survival. The assumptions remain fragile. The men understand this intellectually. They know aircraft are lost. They know crews disappear. They know tomorrow offers no guarantees. Knowledge, however, does not prevent attachment. Knowledge rarely possesses that power. The evening light fades beyond the clouds while mechanics complete their final inspections. Doors close. Reports are filed. Tools return to storage areas. Across the airfield, familiar bombers rest quietly upon familiar hardstands. The scene feels stable, reliable, predictable. For a few brief hours, the cycle appears secure. But beneath that appearance lies a truth the airfield is only beginning to confront. The bombers that keep returning are not teaching the ground crews about certainty. They are teaching them about expectation. And expectation, sooner or later, will be tested. The hardstands that remain empty. The change arrives without ceremony. No single morning announces it. No official declaration marks the transition. The airfield simply reaches a point where absence becomes familiar enough to be noticed differently. The hardstands still fill and empty according to the rhythm of operations. Aircraft continue departing beneath cloud-covered skies. Engines continue returning across evening horizons. Maintenance crews continue moving through routines shaped by months of repetition. Yet now, when a space remains vacant, people remember what once occupied it. That is the difference. Memory has become specific. A cold wind moves across the base before sunrise, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Floodlights cast pale circles onto concrete still dark from the night. Mechanics emerge from workshops and barracks while the airfield slowly awakens around them. The scene resembles countless mornings that came before. But resemblance is not sameness. One hardstand near the edge of the dispersal area remains empty. Not temporarily. Not because an aircraft is undergoing routine maintenance elsewhere on the base. The space is simply vacant. The bomber that once occupied it did not return. Work continues regardless. The institution cannot pause. Fuel still requires delivery. Other aircraft still require inspection. Schedules remain in motion. The machinery of the airfield continues operating with remarkable indifference to individual loss. Yet people notice. Human beings always notice. Not dramatically. Rarely through conversation. Instead, through recognition. A mechanic walking past the vacant position remembers an aircraft that used to stand there. A driver unconsciously glances toward the empty space while crossing the dispersal area. A crew chief studies paperwork and finds himself pausing briefly at a familiar serial number. The memory arrives before intention. The absence has acquired shape. You begin to understand one of the quieter burdens carried by those who remain behind. Loss rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. An aircraft disappears. Months later another. Then another. Each absence appears manageable when viewed individually. Together they begin altering the landscape itself. The base remembers. Not officially. Physically, emotionally, through the people who inhabit it. Morning unfolds beneath low clouds while maintenance activities continue across the remaining aircraft. The bombers still present on the airfield require attention. Their engines must be serviced. Their systems inspected. Their damage repaired. The work possesses a practical quality that leaves little room for extended reflection. Perhaps that is why it proves so valuable. Tasks provide structure. Structure provides movement. Movement helps carry people forward. A mechanic climbs onto the wing of a bomber that returned safely from its previous mission. He kneels beside an engine housing and begins a familiar inspection. The procedure has not changed. The aircraft remains recognizable. The responsibilities remain clear. Yet the emotional context surrounding them has shifted. Every surviving aircraft now exists against the backdrop of aircraft that failed to return. Comparison becomes unavoidable. Not because anyone seeks it. Because absence creates contrast. A bomber that returns repeatedly becomes more noticeable when others do not. A familiar crew attracts attention when familiar crews disappear. The campaign has entered a new phase. Not operationally, psychologically. The men on the ground are beginning to understand that continuity itself is fragile. The realization emerges slowly because people naturally resist it. Routine encourages optimism. Preparation encourages expectation. Maintenance itself depends upon belief in tomorrow. Why repair an aircraft if not for future missions? Why organize equipment if not for future use? The institution functions through forward movement. Yet reality continues introducing interruptions. Clouds drift low enough to obscure portions of the horizon. Rain begins falling lightly. Mechanics continue working beneath the weather because there is little alternative. Water collects along wing surfaces and drips steadily onto the pavement below. Tool handles become cold in gloved hands. The physical environment remains familiar. The emotional environment does not. Near one workshop, maintenance records accumulate on a desk beneath electric light. The documents record practical information. Repairs completed. Components replaced. Inspections performed. Technical details dominate every page. The paperwork rarely records what people remember most. The aircraft that vanished. The crew no longer seen. The hardstand that remains empty. Such memories exist outside official systems. Yet they influence daily life nonetheless. You watch as a vehicle passes through the dispersal area and disappears into mist. The driver likely has responsibilities occupying his thoughts. Deliveries. Schedules. Equipment. The practical realities of military work. Even so, he knows which spaces remain vacant. Most people do. The knowledge becomes part of the landscape. Not every absence carries equal weight. Some aircraft have been present for months. Others only briefly. Some crews become familiar throughout the base. Others remain largely unknown beyond immediate circles. Human attachment follows unpredictable paths. Yet every disappearance contributes something. A gradual erosion of certainty. A growing awareness that the cycle does not simply repeat forever. The bombers continue departing. The bombers continue returning. But now another pattern has become visible alongside them. Some departures create permanent absences. And once the airfield learns to see those absences, it becomes impossible to stop seeing them. The empty hardstands wait beneath the rain. Silent reminders that routine and loss can occupy the same landscape. And that the war is beginning to leave marks not only upon aircraft, but upon the people responsible for bringing them home. The airfield adapts because adaptation is what institutions do. Days continue arriving. Missions continue launching. Maintenance schedules continue filling with tasks demanding attention. New aircraft occasionally arrive from depots and replacement pools. Fresh crews appear. Personnel rotate. The machinery of operations absorbs disruption and converts it into procedure. From a distance, the process can appear almost seamless. Up close, it rarely feels that way. The empty hardstands remain visible. Even when new aircraft eventually occupy some of them, memory lingers longer than logistics. The physical gap may disappear. The mental one often remains. Human beings do not experience replacement the same way institutions do. A serial number can be replaced. A familiarity cannot. Rain gives way to fog as evening approaches. Moisture settles across the airfield, softening edges and muting sound. Buildings emerge from the mist only when one draws close to them. Floodlights create pale halos suspended in the darkness. Aircraft parked along the dispersal areas appear almost ghost-like, their outlines fading into the weather beyond the reach of artificial light. The atmosphere encourages reflection. Not intentionally. Simply because fog alters perception. Distances shrink. The horizon disappears. Attention narrows toward immediate surroundings. You watch a mechanic crossing the airfield beneath a dim lamp. His route takes him past a hardstand that remained empty for weeks before another aircraft eventually arrived to occupy it. The replacement bomber now stands where the previous one once stood. The space has been filled. The memory has not. This is one of the quiet truths rarely captured in operational records. Military organizations depend upon replacement. Aircraft are replaced. Equipment is replaced. Personnel are replaced. Entire units are rebuilt after suffering losses. The process is necessary. Without it, prolonged campaigns become impossible. Yet replacement solves practical problems more effectively than emotional ones. The men understand this without needing to articulate it. A new bomber arrives. It requires maintenance. It develops its own quirks. Its own history begins accumulating. The work continues. At the same time, people remember what came before. The two realities coexist. Near one maintenance bay, several crew chiefs review aircraft readiness reports beneath harsh electric lighting. Their discussion remains focused and technical. Serviceability rates, engine concerns, replacement schedules, the language of operational necessity. Nothing in their conversation suggests sentiment. Yet sentiment exists nonetheless. Not excessive sentiment. Not the sort that interferes with duty. Simply recognition. The recognition that some aircraft occupied daily life long enough to become familiar. And familiarity leaves traces. Outside, fog drifts across the runways while another mission cycle approaches. Mechanics prepare bombers that will soon disappear into darkness and weather. Fuel trucks move methodically between aircraft. Equipment is staged. Final inspections proceed. The routine remains recognizable. The emotional atmosphere continues evolving. Earlier chapters observed expectation, then repetition, then familiarity. Now familiarity begins interacting with absence. The combination produces something new. A quieter form of caution. Not fear. Awareness. A mechanic inspecting a bomber no longer sees only the aircraft before him. Experience encourages broader perspectives. He remembers aircraft that looked equally healthy before failing to return. He remembers crews whose departures seemed entirely ordinary. The memories do not prevent him from doing his work. They simply accompany it. Like weather. Like fatigue. Like the persistent smell of fuel carried across the airfield by changing winds. You begin noticing how carefully people avoid discussing certain possibilities directly. Wartime culture often rewards composure. Excessive speculation serves little purpose. Anxiety rarely improves performance. Most personnel develop habits of restraint. Thoughts remain private. Observations remain understated. The emotional life of the airfield becomes subtle. A glance toward the horizon. A longer pause while reading a familiar name. A brief silence after learning an aircraft is overdue. Small moments accumulate. The campaign continues demanding attention, leaving little space for anything larger. Perhaps that is why the gradual nature of loss matters so much. Sudden catastrophe overwhelms perception. Gradual absence settles into daily life. It becomes part of the environment. part of the routine, part of the atmosphere through which every subsequent mission is experienced. The fog thickens. Aircraft lights glow softly through the mist while ground crews continue their preparations. Engines remain silent for now. The departure still lies ahead. The airfield exists in one of its familiar transitional states, balanced between readiness and anticipation. Yet the balance has shifted. The men preparing these bombers understand more than they once did. Not because they possess better information, because experience has changed them. The campaign has revealed patterns invisible during earlier months. Familiar aircraft disappear. Familiar crews disappear. Empty spaces appear where certainty once seemed strongest. The realization carries no dramatic revelation, only accumulation. Like rainwater gathering in shallow depressions. Like fatigue settling into muscles. Like memories settling into places. Across the base, floodlights reflect from wet concrete while bombers wait for another departure. The machinery of war continues functioning exactly as intended. Schedules remain intact. Procedures remain intact. Tomorrow's mission will proceed. The institution endures. The people endure. Yet beneath that endurance, another condition has taken root. A quiet fatalism. Not surrender. Not hopelessness. Simply the understanding that preparation offers no guarantees. The aircraft will leave. Some will return damaged. Most will return. Perhaps all. Perhaps not. And the men responsible for keeping them airborne have reached the point where they no longer mistake uncertainty for certainty. The hardstands taught them that lesson. One empty space at a time. The weight of experience. Winter arrives quietly. Not through dramatic storms or sudden transformation, but through a gradual hardening of the world surrounding the airfield. Morning darkness lingers longer. Frost appears more frequently along the edges of runways and service roads. Breath becomes visible in the cold air. The wind acquires a sharper quality that finds its way through layers of clothing and settles into hands already worn by months of labor. The season changes the base without altering its purpose. Bombers still depart. Bombers still return. Maintenance continues. The cycle remains intact. Yet winter reveals the cost of endurance more clearly than earlier seasons. Cold weather removes certain illusions. A mechanic crossing the dispersal area before dawn no longer moves with the same energy he possessed months earlier. The difference is not dramatic enough to attract attention. No one points to it. No one discusses it. It simply exists. Experience has weight. The campaign has weight. Time itself has weight. You watch men emerging from barracks beneath skies still untouched by daylight. Their movements possess the confidence of familiarity. They know where they are going. They know what the day will demand. The uncertainty that characterized their first months on the airfield has largely disappeared. Knowledge has replaced it. Knowledge, however, carries its own burdens. The newer arrivals still see aircraft primarily as assignments. Veteran ground crews see histories. One bomber requires additional attention because of recurring structural concerns. Another has accumulated enough repairs that maintenance records resemble biographies more than technical documents. A third continues flying despite problems that seem to return again and again. The aircraft have become old acquaintances. Not old friends. Acquaintances. The distinction remains important. Friendship suggests equality. The relationship between mechanic and aircraft is built upon responsibility. A mechanic knows the machine because he must know it. The familiarity emerges from labor rather than affection. Yet labor creates attachment nonetheless. Near a maintenance shelter, frost glitters faintly along the edges of a bomber's wing while the first light of morning begins spreading across the horizon. The aircraft appears calm, motionless, almost peaceful. Appearances conceal reality. The bomber is tired. Not literally. Machines do not experience exhaustion, but they accumulate strain. The men responsible for maintaining them understand the difference only too well. Every successful mission requires effort afterward. Components must be inspected, damage repaired, wear addressed, systems tested. The aircraft survives because people continuously intervene against the natural consequences of repeated use. The same observation increasingly applies to the people performing the work. The campaign has now lasted long enough for patterns to become visible. A mechanic pauses before climbing a ladder. Another stretches a stiff shoulder. Someone rubs cold hands together before returning to a task. The signs remain small, yet they appear everywhere. Fatigue rarely arrives dramatically. It accumulates through repetition, through interrupted sleep, through long shifts, through months spent working in weather that seems determined to test endurance. The airfield has become a place where both machines and people survive through maintenance. The parallel remains largely unspoken. Still, it exists. Clouds drift low across the countryside while work continues beneath them. The familiar sounds of tools striking metal echo through the cold air. Engines are inspected. Reports completed. Equipment organized. The routines remain unchanged because they must remain unchanged. Institutions depend upon consistency. The bomber campaign demands consistency, regardless of weather, regardless of fatigue, regardless of memory. You begin noticing how much experience has altered perception. Earlier chapters observed aircraft through the eyes of men still learning their environment. Now the ground crews possess enough knowledge to anticipate problems before they appear. A crew chief studies an engine and notices something slightly unusual. Not a failure. Not even a fault. Simply a detail. A sound. A vibration. A pattern. The observation may prove meaningless, or it may prevent a larger problem later. Experience sharpens attention. At the same time, it makes the consequences of failure more visible. The men understand what can happen when small details are overlooked. They have seen the results. Not always directly. Sometimes through damaged aircraft. Sometimes through empty hardstands. Sometimes through the simple absence of familiar routines. Knowledge accumulates. So does caution. The combination creates a different emotional atmosphere from the one that existed during the earlier stages of the campaign. The airfield no longer feels optimistic in the uncomplicated way it once did. Neither does it feel hopeless. The prevailing condition is something more mature. A practical acceptance of uncertainty. The bombers will continue flying. The crews will continue departing. The maintenance work will continue. No one expects certainty anymore. The expectation itself has faded. In its place stands experience. Cold, patient, and difficult to ignore. Across the base, frost begins melting wherever weak sunlight reaches the concrete. Water drips from wing edges. Vehicles move steadily between maintenance areas. The day unfolds according to familiar patterns. Yet beneath every routine now lies a deeper understanding. The campaign is no longer teaching lessons. It has become the lesson. And the people who remain on the ground are carrying that lesson with them every time they step onto the airfield. By now, many of the men can predict the shape of a day before it fully begins. Not the details. The details remain uncertain. Weather changes. Missions change. Mechanical problems emerge without warning. Unexpected events continue appearing with stubborn regularity. Yet the broader rhythm has become familiar. Morning preparation. Departure. Waiting. Return. Repair. Then preparation once again. The cycle turns so consistently that it begins feeling older than the people participating in it. As though the airfield itself is performing a routine that existed long before any individual arrived and will continue long after any individual leaves. The realization can be strangely comforting. It can also be strangely isolating. A mechanic standing beside a bomber during the fading light of afternoon understands that his own role remains temporary. Aircraft are replaced. Personnel rotate. Wars eventually end. The institution continues moving forward regardless of individual stories. And yet individual stories continue unfolding within it. You watch a maintenance crew working beneath a sky already darkening toward evening. Winter daylight disappears quickly. Shadows lengthen across the dispersal area. Lamps illuminate workspaces earlier than they did during previous seasons. The cold sharpens every sound. A wrench striking metal. A ladder shifting position. Footsteps crossing frozen ground. The airfield feels quieter in winter. Not because less work occurs. Because the landscape itself seems to absorb noise. The season encourages inward attention. Perhaps that is why memory becomes more noticeable. Long campaigns create layers of memory that settle upon places. A workshop becomes associated with certain repairs. A hardstand becomes associated with a particular aircraft. A maintenance crew develops habits and routines shared through experience rather than instruction. The airfield becomes a map of accumulated recollections. Most remain invisible to outsiders. A crew chief passing a familiar bomber remembers damage repaired months earlier. A mechanic glances toward a hardstand and recalls an aircraft that once occupied it. A driver crossing the base follows routes so often repeated that they feel instinctive. Memory quietly reshapes geography. The bombers themselves carry visible evidence of time. Repairs overlap repairs. Replacement components coexist beside original ones. Entire sections of certain aircraft have been rebuilt piece by piece over months of operations. The bombers survive because countless people refuse to allow wear, damage, and fatigue to claim them. The effort never truly ends. One problem solved reveals another. One repair completed leads eventually to another repair. Maintenance becomes a conversation with time itself. A conversation time always wins eventually. The men understand this. Perhaps not consciously every day, but deeply. No aircraft flies forever. No engine lasts forever. No campaign continues forever. The reality does not produce despair. It produces perspective. You begin noticing how differently veteran personnel view success compared with newer arrivals. Earlier in the campaign, success often appeared dramatic. Successful missions. Successful repairs. Successful returns. Now success feels quieter. An aircraft functioning normally. A repair holding as expected. A mission completed without unusual complications. The absence of crisis becomes its own achievement. Experience alters definitions. The shift mirrors changes occurring throughout the airfield. The men no longer seek certainty because certainty has proven unattainable. Instead, they seek reliability, competence, consistency, qualities capable of surviving uncertainty. Near one maintenance area, floodlights illuminate an aircraft preparing for another mission cycle. Mechanics move around it with practiced efficiency. Their actions appear almost routine from a distance. Yet routine itself represents accumulated expertise. Every movement reflects knowledge gained through repetition. Every inspection reflects lessons learned through experience. The campaign has shaped these men just as surely as it has shaped the aircraft. The transformation remains difficult to see because it occurred gradually. Month after month, mission after mission, return after return. The changes settled quietly into posture, perception, and expectation. The airfield no longer contains many newcomers. Most people now possess histories connected to the campaign. They have witnessed departures, returns, delays, damage, losses, replacements, endless variations of the same fundamental cycle. Shared experience creates a different kind of community, not necessarily a closer one, simply a deeper one. People require fewer explanations. Certain realities become understood without discussion. The empty hardstands taught some lessons. The returning aircraft taught others. The winter itself contributes additional instruction. Endurance is rarely dramatic. Most endurance looks exactly like ordinary work continuing despite difficult circumstances. A mechanic reporting for another shift. A driver completing another route. A crew chief reviewing another inspection report. Persistence accumulates quietly, like frost gathering overnight. Like repairs accumulating across an aircraft's skin. Like years settling into memory. The airfield continues functioning beneath the cold sky. Engines will start again. Bombers will depart again. The campaign shows no interest in pausing simply because people have grown tired. And yet something important has changed. The men no longer experience the cycle as they once did. The anticipation of earlier months has matured into understanding. The understanding has matured into acceptance. Not acceptance of loss. Not acceptance of failure. Acceptance of reality. The reality that uncertainty remains permanent. The reality that endurance matters more than confidence. The reality that tomorrow's mission can never be guaranteed by yesterday's success. Winter has revealed these truths with particular clarity. The season strips away excess. What remains is the essential character of the airfield itself. Work, responsibility, patience, and the quiet determination to continue preparing aircraft for journeys that no one can completely predict. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary. There comes a point in every long campaign when people stop noticing how unusual their lives have become. The transition is gradual. So gradual that few recognize it while it is happening. A bomber crossing the North Sea in winter weather remains an extraordinary event. Thousands of gallons of fuel. Multiple engines. A crew suspended above cloud and darkness. Enemy territory waiting beyond the horizon. Yet on the airfield, such events occur so frequently that they begin feeling ordinary. The extraordinary becomes routine. Routine becomes expectation. Expectation becomes the framework through which daily life is understood. The transformation is one of the quietest changes observed during prolonged war. A grey morning settles over the base. Low cloud presses downward until the sky appears almost within reach. Moisture hangs in the air without fully becoming rain. Vehicles move along familiar routes. Mechanics emerge from workshops carrying equipment required for another round of inspections. Nothing about the scene attracts special attention. That itself is remarkable. Months earlier, many of these men arrived from places where heavy bombers existed primarily as symbols. Newspaper photographs, newsreel footage, distant representations of military power. Now they walk beneath the wings of such aircraft every day. Familiarity alters scale. You watch a mechanic crossing beneath the wing of a bomber large enough to dominate an ordinary street. He barely glances upward. His attention remains focused upon a maintenance concern waiting near one of the engines. The aircraft no longer surprises him. The scale no longer surprises him. The noise no longer surprises him. Experience has absorbed wonder and converted it into practicality. This process occurs throughout the airfield. A new arrival may pause briefly while watching bombers assemble for departure. Veterans continue working, not because they have lost appreciation for the site, but because the site has become part of the environment. Like weather, like buildings, like the wind crossing the runways, the war has settled into everyday life. The realization extends beyond aircraft. Ground crews become accustomed to conditions that would appear extraordinary elsewhere. Long shifts in poor weather, constant exposure to risk, the knowledge that familiar people may disappear from the airfield without warning. These realities remain significant. They simply cease feeling unusual. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity for normalization. Without it, sustained conflict would be difficult to endure. With it, conflict begins reshaping perception itself. Near one maintenance bay, a bomber undergoes inspection after completing yet another mission. Mechanics move methodically across its structure. Damage is identified. Repairs planned. Reports completed. The process unfolds with calm professionalism. No one pauses to marvel that the aircraft has just crossed hostile territory. No one comments on the distances traveled. Attention focuses upon practical realities. A damaged panel. An engine concern. A maintenance schedule. The extraordinary has become a work order. Clouds drift low across the countryside while the day progresses through familiar stages. The airfield remains busy without appearing hurried. Experience has refined many routines. People know where they belong. Responsibilities have become deeply understood. Competence creates its own atmosphere. Not dramatic. Steady. Reliable. The bomber campaign increasingly depends upon such reliability. The aircraft remain impressive machines, but machines alone cannot sustain operations. The campaign survives through countless acts of ordinary competence performed repeatedly over long periods of time. A mechanic tightening a connection. A driver delivering equipment. A clerk updating records. A weather specialist reviewing forecasts. Most contributions appear small when viewed individually. Together they create continuity. The continuity becomes so dependable that people begin assuming it will persist. That assumption is understandable. It is also dangerous. The airfield has reached a stage where normality risks concealing fragility. Aircraft return often enough that return feels expected. Repairs succeed often enough that success feels expected. The institution functions efficiently enough that functioning feels expected. Yet beneath every expectation remains uncertainty. The reality has not changed. Only perception has. You notice it in conversations. References to previous missions become casual. Damage once considered alarming now receives practical attention rather than emotional reaction. Delays that might have caused concern earlier in the campaign are evaluated with measured patience. Experience encourages calm. At the same time, experience can dull awareness of how extraordinary circumstances truly are. The men continue preparing bombers for journeys that remain profoundly dangerous. They simply do so with the confidence of people who have repeated the process countless times before. The airfield itself seems to embody this transformation. Buildings weathered by months of use continue serving their purposes. Workshops remain active. Hardstands fill and empty. Runways carry aircraft toward uncertain futures and receive them again upon return. Everything functions. Everything continues. The continuity becomes reassuring. Perhaps too reassuring. Because beneath the surface of routine, another reality persists. The campaign continues extracting a price. Aircraft age. People age. Fatigue accumulates. Loss accumulates. The extraordinary may feel ordinary now, but it remains extraordinary nonetheless. And sooner or later, reality has a way of reminding people what they have grown accustomed to forgetting. The airfield does not yet know when that reminder will arrive. Only that it eventually will. The reminder rarely arrives through a single event. History often encourages the search for turning points. A particular battle. A particular decision. A particular day when everything changes. Life on bomber bases is usually less accommodating. Change accumulates gradually. The airfield reaches a point where people look back and realize they have become different from the individuals who first arrived. The transformation reveals itself through comparison. A mechanic who once found engine noise overwhelming now works comfortably beside running aircraft. A crew chief who once studied every mission report with intense curiosity now focuses primarily upon information relevant to maintenance. Men who once counted every departure now learn to conserve their attention. Not because they care less. Because the cycle has become part of them. A light rain begins falling during the afternoon. The weather barely interrupts activity. It seldom does anymore. The men continue moving between aircraft carrying tools and equipment. Jackets darken. Water gathers along the edges of runways and service roads. The airfield absorbs the rain the same way it absorbs countless other inconveniences. By continuing. You watch a maintenance team inspecting a bomber beneath overcast skies. The aircraft has returned from numerous missions. Repairs overlap older repairs. Replacement components sit beside original ones. The machine carries visible evidence of endurance. No one remarks upon it. Months earlier, such evidence might have attracted discussion. Now it simply exists. The bomber campaign has altered expectations. The sight of damaged aircraft no longer surprises anyone. Neither does the sight of repaired aircraft returning once more to operational status. The remarkable has become familiar. This familiarity produces a curious form of emotional distance. Ground crews still perform their responsibilities with care. In many cases, with greater care than ever before. Experience has improved competence. It has sharpened attention. Yet experience has also created protective habits. People learn how to continue functioning inside prolonged uncertainty. They stop reacting to every possibility. They stop imagining every outcome. They narrow their focus toward what can be influenced. The repair in front of them. The inspection awaiting completion. The task that belongs to the present moment. Perhaps that is why the airfield appears so calm despite everything surrounding it. The calm is not ignorance. It is adaptation. Near one operations building, a clerk carries reports between offices while wind drives rain across the pavement. The documents contain information important to the campaign. Mission results. Maintenance requirements. Aircraft status. The paperwork continues accumulating regardless of weather or emotion. Institutions prefer continuity. The war rewards continuity. Every day, the airfield converts uncertainty into procedure. Aircraft arrive. Records are updated. Repairs are scheduled. Resources are allocated. The process repeats. Again, and again, and again. You begin to understand why repetition possesses such power. Repetition shapes not only behavior but perception. Human beings eventually accept almost any condition if exposed to it long enough. The acceptance is not approval. It is adaptation. The men working here have adapted to circumstances that would have seemed extraordinary when they first arrived. Heavy bombers filling the sky. Damage arriving from distant battlefields. Friends disappearing from schedules and rosters. Long nights beneath floodlights. Cold mornings on windswept runways. The realities remain. The surprise has faded. As evening approaches, the airfield prepares for another cycle. Mechanics review final maintenance concerns. Vehicles move steadily between operational areas. Aircraft stand waiting beneath darkening clouds. The scene resembles dozens of evenings before it. That resemblance carries significance. The campaign survives because repetition survives. The institution continues because routine continues. Yet routine cannot entirely erase memory. The hardstands still remember absent aircraft. The maintenance records still contain names and serial numbers no longer active. The people still carry recollections accumulated across months of operations. Normalization has limits. No matter how ordinary the extraordinary becomes, traces remain. A crew chief pauses briefly while examining an aircraft preparing for tomorrow's mission. His attention focuses upon practical concerns. Fuel systems. Structural integrity. Maintenance documentation. Still, somewhere in the background of experience, other thoughts exist. Aircraft once inspected that are no longer here. Crews once greeted that no longer arrive. Patterns once assumed permanent that proved temporary. The memories rarely interrupt the work. They accompany it. Like shadows. Like weather. Like the constant awareness that every departure remains uncertain regardless of how familiar it feels. Darkness begins spreading across the countryside. Lamps illuminate windows. Floodlights awaken across sections of the base. The familiar geography of the airfield transforms into islands of light separated by darkness and mist. The bombers wait. The crews prepare. The mechanics continue their responsibilities. Everything appears stable. Everything appears predictable. The extraordinary has become ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, the campaign continues reshaping people in ways difficult to measure. Not through dramatic revelation. Through accumulation. Through repetition. Through the quiet realization that endurance is not the absence of strain. It is the ability to continue despite it. And nowhere is that reality more visible than on an airfield where the routine has become so familiar that people sometimes forget how remarkable it truly is. The airfield continues. By the second winter, the airfield seems older than its years. Not because the buildings have changed dramatically. Most remain temporary structures erected for a specific purpose. Corrugated walls still rattle beneath strong winds. Wooden walkways still collect mud. Workshops still glow with the same electric light spilling through windows after dark. Yet time has settled over the place. The airfield carries the feeling of an environment that has been used continuously, day after day, by people who rarely have the opportunity to stop and examine what they have built around themselves. The campaign continues. That simple fact shapes everything. A hard frost covers the runways before dawn. Thin crystals cling to grass along the perimeter roads and sparkle briefly beneath vehicle headlights. The cold feels sharper than earlier in the season. It settles into metal, into machinery, into hands reaching for tools before sunrise. The bombers wait beneath the frost. Their surfaces appear almost peaceful. The illusion lasts only until work begins. Soon ladders are positioned. Inspection panels are opened. Engines are checked. Fuel systems are examined. The familiar choreography resumes once more, unfolding across the airfield with the quiet confidence of repetition practiced thousands of times. You watch men moving through the darkness before first light. Many no longer think consciously about the routines guiding their actions. Habit carries them forward. Experience fills gaps that once required concentration. Tasks that seemed complicated months earlier now unfold almost automatically. This is one of the hidden consequences of prolonged service. The work becomes part of the worker. Knowledge settles into muscles as much as memory. A mechanic reaches instinctively toward the correct tool. A crew chief notices a minor irregularity almost before he realizes he has seen it. A driver follows familiar routes across the base without deliberate thought. The airfield has become a landscape of accumulated expertise. Every corner contains evidence. Workbenches worn smooth by constant use. Maintenance records thick with years of entries. Aircraft carrying repairs performed by men who may have already transferred elsewhere. The campaign extends beyond individuals. That realization grows stronger with time. Near one maintenance shelter, a bomber undergoes inspection after completing another sequence of missions. The aircraft has survived long enough that newer personnel assume it has always been there. Veterans remember otherwise. They remember its arrival. Early repairs. Earlier crews. Memory stretches backward now. The campaign has lasted long enough to create its own history. The bomber itself resembles a physical archive. Replacement panels interrupt original surfaces. Different shades of paint reveal work completed months apart. Components manufactured in different factories coexist inside the same machine. The aircraft survives through continuous intervention. The same might be said of the airfield. Nothing here remains unchanged. Personnel arrive and depart. Equipment wears out and is replaced. Procedures evolve. Lessons learned during previous months quietly influence future decisions. The institution survives because it adapts. Morning gradually overtakes the darkness. Frost begins melting wherever sunlight reaches exposed surfaces. Water drips steadily from wings and rooftops. The airfield awakens fully around the bombers. From a distance, the scene appears remarkably ordinary. That ordinary appearance conceals an extraordinary amount of effort. Hundreds of people contribute to a single mission without ever leaving the ground. Fuel handlers, mechanics, clerks, drivers, radio specialists, weather personnel, armorers, supply workers, Most remain invisible within larger historical narratives. Yet the campaign depends upon them. The bombers flying overhead represent only the visible edge of a much larger structure. You begin to notice how completely the ground crews have accepted this reality. Few seem concerned with recognition. The work itself provides sufficient purpose. Aircraft require maintenance. Missions require preparation. The responsibilities remain clear. Clarity becomes valuable during long campaigns. Not because it eliminates uncertainty, because it provides direction despite uncertainty. The wind strengthens as the morning progresses. Clouds move quickly across the sky, casting shifting shadows over the dispersal areas. Mechanics pull jackets tighter and continue working. Vehicles move between hardstands carrying equipment needed elsewhere on the base. Nothing pauses. The campaign does not pause. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson the airfield teaches. Not heroism. Not glory. Continuity. The remarkable ability of ordinary people to continue performing necessary work long after novelty has disappeared, long after certainty has vanished, and long after the weight of experience has settled upon every familiar corner of the base. The bombers remain at the center of that lesson. They depart. They return. They age. They are repaired. And through every stage of that cycle, the airfield continues its patient labor beneath changing skies and passing seasons. The work has become ordinary. The endurance required to sustain it has not. By evening, the frost has disappeared entirely. The runways glisten with moisture left behind by the day's weak sunlight. Water reflects the growing glow of floodlights as darkness returns across the countryside. Beyond the perimeter fence, fields and villages slowly dissolve into shadow. The wider world retreats from view once more, leaving the airfield enclosed within its own familiar boundaries of light, weather, and routine. The transformation occurs every night. No one pays much attention to it anymore. That, perhaps, is another sign of how deeply the campaign has settled into daily life. The extraordinary rhythms of war have become the ordinary rhythms of existence. A mechanic steps from a workshop carrying paperwork that must be delivered before the next shift begins. The cold has returned with the darkness. His breath appears briefly beneath the lamps before vanishing into the night air. Around him, other men move between buildings, hardstands, and maintenance areas with the quiet efficiency of people who know exactly where they belong. The airfield remains active. It always remains active. Even during moments that appear calm, preparation is occurring somewhere. An inspection completed. A report filed. A component replaced. A schedule revised. The machinery of operations never fully sleeps. It merely changes pace. You begin to understand why long campaigns create such powerful habits. Habit allows continuity where enthusiasm cannot. No one can remain inspired every day. No one can remain alert every hour. Yet the work continues because habit carries people through moments when motivation alone would prove insufficient. The bombers benefit from that persistence. Near the edge of the dispersal area, floodlights illuminate an aircraft awaiting another mission. Its surface carries visible evidence of previous journeys. Repaired sections interrupt smooth lines. Fresh maintenance markings appear beside older ones. The bomber is neither new nor old now. It exists somewhere between those conditions, sustained by constant effort. The same description could apply to many of the people surrounding it. The campaign has shaped them. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Through accumulation. Through repetition. through years measured in departures and returns rather than ordinary calendars. A crew chief studies maintenance notes while standing beneath one wing. The aircraft before him represents hundreds of hours of labor performed by countless individuals. Some remain on the base. Others have transferred elsewhere. Some completed their service and returned home. The work remains. That continuity creates a strange sense of permanence inside an environment built upon change. Aircraft change. Personnel change. Weather changes. The cycle remains. As darkness deepens, the sounds of the airfield become softer. Engines are mostly silent now. Conversations remain subdued. Footsteps, vehicle movements, and the occasional metallic echo from a workshop carry farther through the cold air. The atmosphere feels almost reflective. Not because anyone has chosen reflection. Because the pace has slowed enough to reveal it. The campaign continues demanding effort, but effort no longer feels temporary. Many of the men have stopped imagining a clear dividing line between wartime and peacetime. The future exists somewhere beyond the horizon, but daily life unfolds here. On these runways. Inside these workshops. Beneath these floodlights. The airfield has become a world unto itself. A world governed by schedules, weather, machinery, and endurance. You watch a line of maintenance vehicles moving slowly through the darkness. Their headlights sweep across concrete and disappear behind distant buildings. The sight is unremarkable. That is precisely the point. The campaign survives through thousands of unremarkable moments. Not dramatic victories. Not famous speeches. Routine actions repeated faithfully over time. A repair completed correctly. A report delivered on time. An aircraft prepared for another departure. History often remembers outcomes. The airfield remembers processes. And processes possess their own quiet dignity. The floodlights reflect from wet pavement while another shift gradually takes responsibility from the one before it. Work passes from one set of hands to another. The transition occurs smoothly because it has happened so many times before. Continuity once again. Always continuity. The bombers stand waiting in the darkness. Some are familiar veterans of countless missions. Others are newer arrivals still accumulating their histories. All remain dependent upon the same patient labor. The same willingness to continue. The same refusal to let routine become neglect. Winter wind moves across the open ground, carrying the smell of fuel, damp concrete, and distant rain. The airfield listens to the weather. Prepares for tomorrow. Continues its work. And in that continuation lies something larger than any individual aircraft or mission. A lesson learned slowly through months of repetition. Endurance is rarely loud. Most endurance looks exactly like this. People returning to necessary work because necessary work remains. The airfield continues. And because it continues, the campaign continues with it. The last repairs before dawn. Some of the most important work on the airfield happens when almost everyone else is asleep. The runways lie quiet beneath darkness. Floodlights cast pale pools across sections of concrete while large portions of the base disappear into shadow. Barracks windows remain dark. Offices sit empty. The countryside beyond the perimeter fence has surrendered completely to the night. Yet the maintenance areas remain awake. A single lamp glows inside a workshop. An engine stand sits beneath a shelter where mechanics continue working in heavy coats. A truck moves slowly across the dispersal area carrying equipment needed before morning. The campaign never truly pauses. It simply becomes quieter. You watch the airfield during those hours between midnight and dawn when activity narrows to essentials. The atmosphere differs from any other time of day. The urgency of departure has not yet arrived. The bustle of afternoon operations has faded. The waiting associated with returning aircraft belongs to another cycle entirely. What remains is preparation. Pure preparation. The patient labor that exists before movement begins again. Winter clouds drift across the moon, alternately revealing and concealing sections of the base. Moisture gathers along aircraft surfaces exposed to the cold. Frost forms gradually on wing edges. Water trapped in small depressions begins turning to ice. The weather continues its work. So do the men. Near one bomber, a maintenance crew studies an issue discovered during the previous inspection cycle. The problem is not catastrophic. Most problems are not. Catastrophic failures attract attention precisely because they are rare. The majority of maintenance work concerns small imperfections identified before they become larger ones. A worn component. An unusual vibration. A pressure reading slightly outside expectations. The campaign survives through attention to such details. The mechanics move carefully beneath portable lamps. Their shadows stretch across aluminum surfaces and frozen concrete. Conversation remains minimal. Not because anyone has forbidden it, but because fatigue encourages silence. Many have already worked long hours. Tomorrow will demand more. The reality has become ordinary. Across the base, dozens of similar tasks unfold simultaneously. A radio system is tested. Hydraulic lines are inspected. Fueling equipment is prepared for the morning. Records are updated to reflect repairs completed during the evening. Each task appears minor when viewed alone. Together they create readiness. The airfield depends upon readiness. A bomber preparing for departure rarely reveals the hundreds of separate actions that made its departure possible. The aircraft appears complete, functional, prepared. The hidden labor remains hidden. That invisibility has accompanied ground crews throughout the campaign. Their successes often leave no visible trace. A repaired system works as expected. An inspected component avoids failure. A corrected problem never develops into a crisis. The evidence of good maintenance is frequently the absence of disaster. You begin to understand why experience changes the way these men view accomplishment. Earlier in the campaign, success may have felt connected to visible outcomes. Aircraft returning. Missions completed. Damage repaired. Now success often feels quieter. A problem discovered early. A mistake prevented. A concern addressed before anyone else notices it. The standards become higher because knowledge becomes deeper. The night air grows colder. A mechanic removes his gloves briefly to handle a delicate task requiring precision. Within moments the cold reaches his fingers. He pulls the gloves back on and continues. Around him, similar compromises occur constantly. Comfort yields to necessity. Convenience yields to responsibility. Not through heroism. Through habit. The campaign has trained entire communities of people to continue functioning despite discomforts that once would have attracted complaint. The adaptation remains remarkable precisely because it feels unremarkable. Beyond the maintenance areas, rows of bombers stand quietly beneath the darkness. Some carry scars accumulated across months of operations. Others remain comparatively new. Under moonlight and frost, however, the distinctions become difficult to see. The aircraft appear united by stillness. For a few brief hours, they are free from noise, free from movement, free from the demands awaiting them at dawn. The peace feels temporary because it is temporary. Everyone understands this. Morning will arrive. Engines will start. The cycle will continue. That certainty has become one of the few reliable elements remaining in a world otherwise shaped by uncertainty. The mechanics know it. The crew chiefs know it. The drivers crossing frozen roads know it. Tonight's repairs are not endings. They are preparations. The final adjustments before another day begins unfolding across the airfield. And as the hours slowly move toward dawn, the base enters one of its most revealing states. A place sustained not by urgency or excitement, but by the quiet discipline of people continuing their work when no one is watching. The hours before dawn possess a different quality from the rest of the night. Midnight belongs to darkness. Dawn belongs to expectation. Somewhere between them lies a period when the airfield seems suspended outside ordinary time. The next mission has not yet begun. The previous day's work has not fully disappeared. The base exists in a narrow space between conclusion and renewal. The mechanics feel it most clearly. Their work is approaching completion, but completion never means finality. Every repaired component, every inspected system, every signed maintenance record points toward a future task rather than a finished one. The bomber is ready for tomorrow. Tomorrow will create new requirements. The cycle remains unbroken. A cold mist begins forming along the lower sections of the airfield. It gathers in shallow depressions and drifts across open ground, softening the edges of buildings and vehicles. Floodlights shine through it in pale columns. The world seems smaller now, more intimate. You watch a mechanic descend from a maintenance stand after completing a final inspection. He pauses briefly beside the aircraft. Not for ceremony, not for reflection, simply to review his work one last time. The habit has become instinct. Months of experience have taught him that certainty is earned through repetition. One inspection becomes two. One verification becomes another. Trust exists, but trust is always accompanied by confirmation. The bomber stands quietly before him. Its engines are silent. Its propellers motionless. Its aluminum skin reflects the faint glow of distant lamps. In a few hours, the same aircraft will vibrate with noise and movement. Crew members will climb aboard. Vehicles will gather around it. Engines will awaken. The runway will call it forward once more. For now, however, it belongs to the night. The airfield itself seems to breathe more slowly during these final hours before morning. Vehicle traffic decreases. Conversations become rarer. Doors open and close less frequently. Even the weather appears subdued, as though waiting alongside everyone else. The stillness reveals details often hidden during busier periods. The creak of a ladder settling against metal. The distant hum of a generator. Water dripping steadily from a roof edge. The quiet footsteps of someone crossing the dispersal area alone. Such sounds would disappear beneath daytime activity. At night they become the atmosphere itself. Near a workshop, a small group of mechanics completes paperwork associated with repairs finished only minutes earlier. The documents are practical and unremarkable. Part numbers. Inspection results. Maintenance notes. Yet the pages represent something larger. They are records of continuity. Evidence that another aircraft has been prepared. Evidence that another mission may proceed. Evidence that countless small acts of attention continue holding the larger system together. The war often appears enormous when viewed from a distance. Entire nations mobilized. Entire continents affected. The airfield offers a different perspective. A closer one. A perspective where outcomes depend upon individual tasks completed correctly by tired people working beneath floodlights and winter skies. The campaign survives because responsibility survives. You begin noticing how little recognition accompanies most of this labor. There are no crowds observing the repairs. No ceremonies marking the completion of inspections. No dramatic acknowledgement when a difficult problem is solved. The work disappears into tomorrow. That disappearance is part of its purpose. A repaired aircraft should not attract attention. A functioning system should feel ordinary. Success becomes invisible. The mechanics understand this better than anyone. Perhaps that understanding contributes to the calm atmosphere surrounding them. The work does not require applause. It requires completion. Once completed, attention naturally moves forward toward the next responsibility waiting beyond the horizon. The eastern sky begins changing almost imperceptibly. Not light yet. Only less dark. The distinction matters. Dawn always arrives gradually across the airfield. Shadows soften before they retreat. Shapes emerge before colors. The world reveals itself in stages. The men notice. Everyone notices. Because dawn changes the meaning of their work. What was preparation becomes readiness. What was possibility becomes schedule. What was quiet labor becomes part of an operational day already beginning to take shape. The mist continues drifting across the runways while the first signs of morning gather beyond the clouds. Aircraft stand waiting in familiar positions. Maintenance crews finish their final tasks. Drivers prepare vehicles for another cycle of movement. The airfield is awakening again. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Patiently. The same way it always does. And as the darkness slowly gives way to morning, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The campaign has been sustained not merely by aircraft, fuel, or machinery. It has been sustained by repetition. By discipline. By thousands of quiet hours like these. Hours when the world appears asleep. Yet the work continues. Hours when the bombers rest beneath frost and mist while unseen hands prepare them for another journey. Hours when endurance reveals its truest form. Not in moments of crisis, but in the decision to keep going long after the work has become familiar. The airfield after the mission. Eventually, every long campaign develops an afterlife. Not an ending. Not yet. The bombers still depart. The maintenance crews still work. The runways still carry aircraft into uncertain skies. The machinery of operations remains active. Yet something has changed. The airfield now carries the accumulated weight of everything that has already happened. Morning spreads slowly across the base beneath a sky layered with pale cloud. Frost lingers in shaded corners. Water glitters along the edges of concrete where yesterday's thaw refroze during the night. The familiar landscape appears unchanged, but familiarity itself has become part of the story. The men no longer experience the airfield as they once did. Every building contains memories. Every workshop contains memories. Every hardstand contains memories. The campaign has lasted long enough for the present to share space with the past. You see it in small moments. A mechanic crossing the dispersal area passes an aircraft he helped repair months earlier. The repair itself has long since disappeared beneath newer work. Additional missions have come and gone. Other problems have demanded attention. Yet memory remains. not as nostalgia, as awareness. The bomber before him is not merely today's aircraft. It is also yesterday's aircraft, and last month's, and the aircraft that survived countless departures and returns before arriving at this particular morning. The same transformation has occurred throughout the airfield. Near a maintenance shelter, a crew chief reviews inspection records while standing beside a bomber preparing for another operation. The paperwork concerns immediate realities, current conditions, current repairs, current requirements. Yet experience encourages a wider perspective. He remembers earlier entries, earlier concerns, earlier crews. Time has layered itself upon the aircraft until no single mission can be understood entirely on its own. Everything belongs to a larger sequence now. The realization alters the atmosphere of the base. Earlier chapters observed anticipation, then repetition, then familiarity, then acceptance. Now acceptance begins maturing into something deeper. Perspective. The campaign continues, but the people sustaining it understand the campaign differently than they once did. A driver guides a vehicle slowly across the airfield while weak sunlight struggles through the clouds. The route is familiar, every turn known, every building recognizable. The journey requires little conscious thought. Habit has transformed movement into memory. The same process shapes nearly every aspect of life here. The mechanics know the aircraft. The aircraft know the weather. The weather knows the seasons. Everything feels connected through repetition. The airfield has become an ecosystem of accumulated experience. Perhaps that is why the pace seems calmer than before. Not slower, calmer. The urgency of earlier months has been absorbed into routine. People still work diligently. Aircraft still require attention. Missions still demand preparation. Yet confidence now comes less from optimism than from understanding. The men know what can happen. They also know what can be endured. Those lessons were not learned through instruction. They were learned through time. A bomber stands near the edge of the dispersal area carrying visible evidence of a long operational life. Repairs intersect older repairs. Replacement panels interrupt original surfaces. Maintenance markings accumulate like layers of handwriting added to the same page over many months. The aircraft resembles the airfield itself. Both have been shaped by repeated use. Both continue functioning despite visible wear. Both survive through constant care. You watch mechanics moving around the bomber beneath the cold morning sky. Their actions remain practical, deliberate, familiar. Nothing dramatic occurs. That, in many ways, is the point. The great lesson of the airfield was never contained within dramatic moments. It emerged through continuity, through ordinary days repeated often enough to become extraordinary in retrospect. The campaign continues generating missions. The airfield continues preparing aircraft. The men continue performing their responsibilities. Yet beneath every task now lies an awareness impossible to separate from experience. The work is no longer simply about tomorrow's departure. It is also about everything that came before. Every repaired aircraft. Every successful return. Every empty hardstand. Every lesson accumulated across seasons of weather, fatigue, uncertainty, and endurance. The bombers remain at the center of the cycle. But the cycle itself has become the story. And as another morning unfolds across the runways and maintenance areas, the airfield carries that story forward once more, quietly, patiently, and without any expectation that anyone beyond its fences will ever fully understand it. The afternoon arrives beneath a sky that cannot decide between winter and spring. Clouds drift across intervals of pale sunlight. Patches of brightness appear briefly upon the runways before disappearing again beneath moving shadows. Water runs slowly along drainage channels beside the concrete. The landscape feels suspended between seasons, uncertain whether to hold on to the cold or release it. The airfield understands such uncertainty well. It has lived within uncertainty for years. Yet now uncertainty no longer dominates the emotional character of the place. It exists alongside something else. Perspective. The distinction matters. Earlier in the campaign, uncertainty demanded attention because it felt immediate. Every departure raised questions. Every return carried significance. Every delay seemed important. Now the men have experienced enough cycles to recognize patterns larger than individual events. The campaign continues. Aircraft arrive and depart. Damage appears and is repaired. Personnel come and go. The broader rhythm endures. You watch a mechanic standing beside a bomber whose operational history stretches back through countless missions. The aircraft no longer represents a single story. It represents accumulation. Layers of labor. Layers of experience. Layers of survival. The same is true of the man standing beside it. The campaign has changed him as surely as it has changed the machine. Not through dramatic transformation. Through repetition. Through responsibility. Through the quiet habit of continuing. The realization settles over the airfield like weather. No one announces it. No one records it in official reports. Yet it becomes visible everywhere. In the way people move. In the way they speak. In the way they approach familiar tasks. Experience has stripped away many illusions. The men no longer expect certainty. They no longer expect permanence. What remains is a steadier understanding of reality. The bombers will fly. Some will return damaged. Most will return. Some will not. The work remains necessary regardless. Near the maintenance areas, vehicles continue their slow movement between workshops and hardstands. Mechanics inspect aircraft preparing for future missions. Crew chiefs review records. Drivers deliver supplies. The activity appears ordinary. That appearance conceals years of accumulated effort. The airfield functions because thousands of previous days prepared it to function. Every routine contains history. Every procedure contains lessons. Every successful departure depends upon knowledge earned through earlier mistakes, earlier repairs, earlier experiences. The campaign has become self-teaching. Its lessons survive inside people and systems long after the original circumstances have passed. The afternoon light softens as clouds thicken overhead. A light wind moves across the runways. Aircraft remain parked in familiar positions while maintenance continues around them. The scene feels calm. Not because danger has disappeared. Because danger has become understood. Understanding alters emotional weight. Fear demands attention. Understanding encourages acceptance. The distinction explains much about the atmosphere that now surrounds the airfield. The men have not become indifferent. They have become experienced. There is a difference. Indifference stops caring. Experience learns how to care without becoming overwhelmed. The airfield itself seems to embody that lesson. It remembers absence without becoming defined by absence. It remembers uncertainty without surrendering to uncertainty. It remembers fatigue without allowing fatigue to stop the work. The campaign continues because people continue. Simple. Difficult. True. As evening approaches, shadows lengthen across the dispersal areas. The familiar cycle prepares to begin once more. Another mission. Another departure. Another sequence of waiting and return. The machinery remains unchanged. The people operating it have changed profoundly. Not through singular events. Through accumulation. The years have taught them that endurance is not a temporary condition. It is a way of moving through uncertainty. A way of continuing despite incomplete information, despite fatigue, despite disappointment, despite loss. The lesson extends beyond aircraft and airfields. It belongs to anyone who has carried responsibility for a long time. The bombers simply provided the setting in which the lesson became visible. You watch the evening settle across the base. Floodlights begin awakening. Windows glow with artificial light. Vehicles continue their routes through the growing darkness. Aircraft stand waiting beneath clouds that have witnessed countless departures and returns. The airfield continues. That continuity is neither dramatic nor glamorous. It is something quieter. A form of endurance so familiar that people often overlook it while living inside it. Yet it remains remarkable. The campaign has revealed many truths. Perhaps the most enduring of them is this. The history of war is not sustained only by those who cross oceans, enter battle, or appear in photographs. It is also sustained by those who remain. Those who repair. Those who prepare. Those who wait. And those who return the next morning to begin again. Many years later, the runways remain. Some survive intact. Others fade beneath grass, weather, and time. Concrete cracks. Buildings disappear. Roads once crowded with military traffic return to quieter purposes. The countryside gradually reclaims what the war borrowed. Yet traces endure. A stretch of runway crossing an English field. A foundation hidden beneath weeds. A memorial standing where aircraft once gathered before dawn. The landscapes remember. So do the people who passed through them. The bombers themselves are largely gone now. Scrapped. Preserved in museums. Reduced to photographs and fragments of memory. The engines that once shook entire villages have fallen silent. The missions belong to history. What remains is the human experience that surrounded them. The waiting. The preparation. The endless sequence of ordinary tasks performed beneath extraordinary circumstances. You can still imagine the airfield at first light. Frost on the concrete. Mechanics moving through the darkness. Aircraft waiting beneath low cloud. The smell of fuel drifting across cold air. The quiet confidence of people preparing for work they understood could never offer guarantees. The war often appears dramatic when viewed from a distance. Closer examination reveals something else. Patience. Responsibility. Continuity. The determination to continue performing necessary work despite uncertainty. The bombers carried those lessons across Europe. The ground crews carried them across years. And perhaps that is why the old airfields still feel meaningful long after the aircraft have gone. They remind us that endurance is rarely loud. Most endurance looks exactly like an ordinary day repeated one more time. The wind moves across the empty runways now. Grass bends where bombers once taxied. Evening light settles across fields that have long since returned to peace. And somewhere within that quiet landscape, the echoes remain. Not the echoes of engines. The echoes of persistence. The echoes of preparation. The echoes of people who kept returning to their work because others depended upon it. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.